All right, team. It should be up and on. What we're going to do now. Righto, guys. Sorry, team. I've stolen this table. So grab a seat. There's some documents there. Grab one of those, guys, and there's a roll floating around as well. All right, give it a go. The chat's not coming up. We'll work our way around that. All right, everybody's got it. Just made it. Okay, team, we're going to kick this off. I'm trying to pop my stream up with the chat on the screen. My chat should be there, and it's not. I don't quite know why. Alright, but we'll leave that for the time being if it's just not going. Okay. Hi again. Alright, we'll kick it off with the second topic, which is to do with law in the context of Australia. Now, a couple of things. Look, I had actually set this up for this particular lecture, or rather the first two topics, to only be assessed in the test. So if you check the subject outline, it's only assessed in the test. But I've actually wondered, and certainly noted from previous years, whether or not it might still be worth including some of this content in the assignment and or the exam. Now, because it's not in the subject outline, and the reason for that is, look, to be frank, it's actually a little bit easier than some of the substantive stuff. So what I'm going to do, I want you guys can have a little think about that, because we're going to do the topics today, and we're going to do the stat interpretation exercise. And so we're just going to be going through and exposing to you guys to law at a bit more of a deeper level as part and parcel of this. And so it's whether or not you guys find this style of analysis, doing stat interpretation and doing the legal history stuff, worthwhile, and you want it, basically if you want to be assessed on it, or you don't. It's purely going to be up to you guys in terms of choosing. It's one of those really nice things about master's level subjects. It's you guys collectively, democracy and all that, really get to guide the process. So that's something just to have a think about in terms of the material today. If you hate the material from today, that's fine too. It's still in your test. You'll still be tested on it, but I can leave it out of the major assignment and exam. It's going to be completely up to you guys. All right, so again, like last week, we'll probably do it in 3 sessions. We're going to go for a little bit, about 30, 40 minutes. Then we'll do some practical tasks and some questions. And then I'll go and talk a little bit more, repeat that process 3 times throughout the thing. In terms of a little bit of admin, the front door there is, in theory, the security guys have unlocked it until 6:30. And an update in terms of changing rooms. The request is still being processed. It actually came back because they thought there were only 12 students in the class, and they sort of gave me grief about it. Why are you requesting for a student? But they were wrong because they were looking at the external subjects, and so now that's gone back again. I don't know why this took a week. But we'll see how we go. We're moving buildings. The law and business school are moving to building 28, so we're probably going to get a room in and around there as well. Okay, are there any questions from last week as well, guys, for just in terms of the content or any admin things? Because if there are any questions, odds are good that someone else is probably thinking the same thing. If not, then I'll just move on. Yes.
Okay, so I went over my notes, and on slide 8 we have the categories of domestic law.
Yes.
Criminal, civil, constitutional, and
yes.
regulatory.
Yeah, it's a broad. Those are really kind of broad areas.
Because I didn't write down what is regulatory, and when I googled it, I couldn't understand it.
No, okay. The idea is that it's really to do with governance, so corporations law and administrative law. It's the control of actions outside of the scope of individual one-on-one control. That's really what it means. And government law. It's governance in terms of corporations and bodies corporate, including things like state and city councils, and bodies that aren't strictly speaking parliamentary bodies, so they're not making laws, like validly passing them through Parliament. Parliament's already passed a law that says, for example, the James Cook University. James Cook University, there is a council, and the Act says the council have power to fine people, and they have power to fine people up to this much, and literally it's like 10 penalty units.
So it's a law within an organization?
Essentially, yeah. It's an organisation, which can be like a state council, a government ministry, or a body that's created under a statute. But it also includes privately created companies, the governance involved with that stuff. Basically, it's when you're having to deal with entities, but it's not usually one party fighting another one. It's not really adversarial. When you're going and dealing with government bodies and dealing with the councils and dealing with things, usually it's you as the citizen applying to get your particular result. Sometimes they fight it, sometimes they don't, but you're having to use the system to do that. That's really the hallmarks of that aspect of law, really. And look, it's not really a very exact science. It's really an umbrella term to describe them. You probably won't be assessed on something like that because it's not quite as clearly cut, as opposed to some of the other areas where there are clear delineations, common law, equity, and statute, for example. Those are genuine, real, tangible things where we can see the difference between them.
I didn't think it was that important, but I just couldn't understand it for the life.
Yeah. It's some of the topics of these slides they've come from. I've sort of inherited them and sort of changed them and moved them as time's gone by, and sometimes they reflect the brains of people that have previously taught these things over a long time. But this one today, dispute resolution, we're looking at Australia. So this lecture, the seminar, is a little bit more fun / lighthearted because it's a little bit more of an exploration of Australian history. And for most of you guys, I imagine that you probably haven't studied too much Australian history. Has anybody had to do the citizenship test? Has anybody had to do that at some stage? Is anybody planning on doing it at some stage? I had to do the citizenship test about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was teaching this sort of stuff here, so it didn't take me very long. It took me about 60 seconds. It's very, very, very easy, but this will make it even easier if you are planning on doing that at some stage. So we're going to go over Australian legal history in particular. It's a little bit of me sort of talking about stuff, but I'll really emphasise the key events, the key points in time where there was a real noticeable change in the legal environment of Australia. I'll talk about and reiterate some of these aspects of how this has developed, the reception of British law, the position of equity in that system, and how that sits these days. It used to be done by the priests, now it's done by the courts, the court system, this court of conscience. Then we're going to do some more hard areas. We're going to be doing, hey guys, there's some sheets there, and there's the roll design as well. We're going to be looking at the stare decisis and the doctrine of precedent, how this works in courts. But the practical exercise we've got, which is something of a challenging one, is a statutory interpretation exercise. So we'll be doing that later in the evening. It's to do with the test for residency. Is anyone here doing tax law at the moment, or has done it at the undergraduate level? Cortana, you've done it? Remember they're doing the test for residency? Yeah, it's that test. So that we're going through the doing stat interpretation on it with a little bit of common law interpretation. And finally, the last bit's on ADR, alternative dispute resolution. That's mechanisms that people have and use to avoid going to court. That's really what that's about. All of the steps and processes that are in place to do that. Just a note on the thing there. I have no idea whether the chat's still not working, but this recording, this is actually the live recording that's going up on the screen. So anything that I do and change here takes about, back to tell you, it takes about this long to change. It's a few seconds. Yeah, it's definitely a few seconds. So I'll try to be conscious of that. Okay. All right. So I can do this as like a trivia exercise, but I think I talked about some of it last week. How long have people been in Australia? It's quite a long time. There's a bit of political arguing over this, but I have in the past started even earlier, which is basically an anthropological chat. Who wants to hear a little bit of history? You're going to lose 10 minutes of your life, that's all. Are you willing to lose 10 minutes of your life?
Go for it.
All right, let's do it. So, humans walked out of Africa a long time ago, precursors to the Homo sapien, and formed hunter-gatherer type arrangements. So people would go out in all sorts of places, but were basically living and moving from place to place. Okay? It really wasn't until humans were able to use agriculture. And the very first place where this happened is in the Fertile Crescent. So the rivers of the Tigris, all the way through what is now the Levant. So modern day Kuwait, up through Iraq, down to what's Israel and the Sinai. It's known as the Fertile Crescent. And that is where the first remnants of agriculture come from. And this is important in the context of Australian history as well, because we recognise and can see and trace agriculture as the key indicia of civilization. And so humans did, however, form centres, particularly around really good river systems. And so the anthropologists and the archaeologists point to the rivers around the Ganges, the Tigris and Euphrates, as I've mentioned, the Nile, the Pearl and Yangtze river basins in China. So if you can sort of see where this is coming from. The India, China, Egypt, the Sumerians, I can't pronounce it, Metapotasi, them, and then later the Babylonians. Also, when people walked, and this is again during the last ice age, to North America and traveled all the way south. And so those civilizations, the Central and South American civilizations, were a little bit, I guess, behind in terms of development because it's a little bit harder there. But they built civilizations there. And also the PNG Highlands is credited as being one of the early centers, great centers of civilization. Okay? So we think about the relationship between Asia and the Middle East and Europe. Europe came later for a variety of reasons. The soil is harder to till, to actually do it, particularly in Northern Europe. It's more fertile, but it's harder to till. Okay. One of the things that did happen, though, as time went by, is that when you've got agriculture, when you're harvesting during the summer, and you're taking particularly wheat and sorghum and rice, these sort of staple crops, the ability to take them, dry them, and store them for the winter meant that you could actually have a surplus of food. Has anybody played the computer game Civilization or heard of it? Civilization is one of the most sort of famous computer games. It sort of begins at this point of time where people have basic agriculture, because once you've got a surplus of food, you can start to do things. And so if we look at the very, very ancient centers of civilization, the ability to produce things like writing and other sorts of technology, the wheel, being able to develop time and thought into creating better technology for agriculture, better technology for storing food and preparing food. All of this meant that you could sustain larger populations. And in theory, with larger populations, you could have some fraction of those who were able to keep developing things. All right. Now, come on, guys. There's sheets. Take a pair of those sheets there, and there's a roll floating around as well. All right. So those were the great centres, and other aspects or branches of civilization walked out from there. People literally walked to Australia they reckon about 40,000 years ago. Look, it's something of a political thing too. I'm loath to put a very fixed number on it. Some people will say less, some people will say more, but the anthropologists generally agree somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years. So quite a long time that people had walked here, but the systems in terms of agriculture were much, much, much smaller than there were in the great centres, and in other centres that spread out from those too. And again, other places in Africa, all around the Middle East, all through Eurasia and Europe, and other places in Asia, Indonesia and so on like that. So you had civilization and people spread out across a long time. So by the time a guy by the name of Alexander, who was a Macedonian. Everybody heard of Alexander? Alexander the Greek, but if you ever talk to the Greeks, the Macedonians say that they were his as opposed to theirs. Now, this was, he lived in about, look at this year, right, somewhere between, it was about 400 BC, I think, plus or minus, might have been earlier. But you appreciate at the time, it's very, very difficult to raise a large army and go on campaign. Humans have been fighting each other because it turns out it's easier to just take and steal someone's stuff, take and steal their food and fight them often than it is to get your own. But when you're starting to go long distances, it's very, very hard to have the supply chains to do that. And so Alexander's tutor was a guy called Aristotle, which is one of the famous figures in Western philosophy. He famously wrote about the city-state as being the highest form of power. There's nothing greater than the individual city-state. And he was writing this just as Alexander was going around conquering and creating essentially what we would call an empire. So he conquered most of the Middle East, conquered a big chunk of Europe, came to the, not sure which of the rivers, one of the rivers, it might have been the Ganges itself, and then turned around. So he didn't go beyond there into most of what would be the subcontinent now. But the key thing here is that it's really to do with technology, and particularly food technology, the ability to supply your armies. And this theme, sadly, is recurrent throughout human history. So you've had that. Later, after the Greeks, you had the Romans. And the Romans came and basically emulated or tried to emulate what the Greeks had done in Europe. Now, you've got to appreciate, though, that Asia and Europe, by some sort of bizarre sort of curve, seem to have been going up and down at different sorts of times. And so at the time when Asia, here I'm thinking East Asia, particularly China, was something of a lull, the Western world, and here I'm thinking around the Mediterranean, was, you could say, thriving. So the Romans were really, really good at fighting. They developed systems of warfare. They didn't have very good boats. They didn't have very good horses. They had amazing infantry and drill. If you guys know much about the Roman legions, big shields. So you could have your big shield, and you do drill formations where you take your big shield, march in formation so that your enemy archers can't come through, and they have your spears so you can't be cavalry charged. And when you get up to the enemy, you stab the one to your right. And you repeat that process. And they did. They did and conquered. And now, one thing that, the people that have spent a lot of time in Italy will I'm sure very happy to tell you, is that there are still roads in use. There are literally Roman roads still in place now that are still being used.
Even the waterways too.
Yeah.
Half of Rome is with the Roman waterways.
That's right. They had the engineering skill and they had the water skill. What you did have, though, as an interesting thought, when you start to think about how much labor went into a lot of these things. And the labor, how do you generate all of that work for your economy? If you have an awesome army, you take slaves. And so that you do have this aspect, sorry, it's going to give me the look of doom. But the part of going and doing that is that you need to generate an amount of work, and to have a workforce to do that over a long period of time. You go, you conquer, you take slaves, they do the work. The idea of the Roman citizenry, at least at the end of the Roman Republic. Which one?
It's because when the Roman Empire was growing up,
yeah,
they started to import the barbarian people.
Yeah.
Because they were told tough.
Yeah, that's right.
People, they were short.
Yeah.
So they started, to import these people because
that's right.
The Romans were rich and they didn't want to work anymore. And
yeah.
All the poor jobs
yep.
were to the barbarian people.
Absolutely.
What's happened after 300 years?
Yeah.
There were more barbarian than Romans.
Yeah. And they don't want to work anymore.
Diocletian was the first Roman Empire, was the first imperator that was barbarian. And then after another 100 years,
yep.
because there were no Romans anymore,
yeah.
the Roman Empire collapsed.
That's right. So you have this idea that we go and we take people and we think about in terms of the work and in terms of the idea that Roman citizenry, and it seems strange for us to think of that, particularly the Australians at the moment, the idea of being on the dole. We think that we sort of look down upon that culturally in terms of being unemployed as somehow being a very negative thing. But if you actually stop and think about it, that's a great and glorious thing. Other people are doing work and I'm not. Why are they doing this? Because I'm Roman. You just stop and think about that little mechanic. And that works for a little bit until you can't keep fighting, until you can't sustain this anymore. And then it starts to implode. And certainly that's what really did happen as part of doing this. Now, what you guys may or may not know is that Rome, the western side, based in Rome, was sacked and really went into decline after about 100 AD. The eastern side of the empire, and a guy called Constantine moved the capital to a city that he called Constantinople, which is now modern-day Istanbul. All right, and so that we actually don't sort of appreciate that, but that side of the Roman Empire outlasted the western side by 1,000 years. It didn't fall until the 15th century to the Turks. The Turks came through and do that. Now, Ottomans. So that's and so one of the key things about this, though, is that people for a long time have been wanting cool manufactured goods from China. Let's go back to that idea of these civilizations with a little bit of extra food, and the farm valleys around the Pearl Delta and places like that, they were excellent at agriculture. The Chinese were very, very good in getting rice and storing it, which meant they were able to supply people who could be things like craftsmen. And so manufactured goods, it's kind of funny now we think of getting everything from China. No. People have been getting stuff from China for a really long time. And again, the height of the Roman Empire, you had a trade network that would go all the way from Tyre, Phoenicia, modern-day Lebanon, all the way through a series of caravans to China and to Japan. All right? And anyone know what that was called? It's called the Silk Road. The Silk Road, a series of trade networks. What happened as the Byzantine, the eastern side of the Roman Empire, fell, is that all of the various little city-states, which is what the Mediterranean had sort of descended to, the Roman Empire on the western side, had, I guess, reverted to having little city-states. Genoa, Naples, Venice, each of their own little powers ruled by their own little dukes, Milan and so on. They still wanted stuff from China. Okay, people have been wanting this stuff for a long time. And once the Ottomans came, took Constantinople by force in 1452-53, that was the end of it. The Turks, Islamic Turks, had no love of Western Europe. And so that became very, very hard to go through and do this. So if you stop and think about that, if you're a merchant in Venice, and it's the year or Venice, or Castile in what's modern-day Spain, or Portugal, all of these little regions, you are faced with a business problem. What's that business problem? How do we get stuff from China? Okay, so you just put yourself, you imagine if you're one of the rulers of one of these city-states, and you know where it is. You know that you can go around this long, terribly arduous route, past the Canary Islands, down the bottom of Africa, where the Skeleton Coast is called that, because if your boat breaks on the Skeleton Coast, off the coast of Namibia, you are dead. There is no water, there's no nothing. And then, once you reach the Cape, you then have to go around, and everywhere you go, you're having local leaders in Zanzibar and Tanzania, around the Cape of Africa. All of these places, you're going to have locals. They're going to be like, you want some stuff? We'll you pay us, and we'll resupply your boats. It was a very, very difficult thing to get all the way around. It's a huge, long way through the Straits of Malacca, all the way to China and Japan. Huge route, very, very difficult. The Portuguese were the ones that would build boats that could go through and do that. But it's an expensive, tough, risky way. And so, some bright spark managed to convince a local ruler that they should go westwards to try and solve this business problem. So, anybody know what year and what person that was? Columbus in 1492. So, trying to solve a business problem. Contrary to history myth, people knew the earth was round. They just got the numbers wrong. So funnily enough, the ancient Greeks were actually better at estimating the earth than the Spanish and Portuguese were. So they got it wrong. So when Columbus arrives at these islands, in modern day, the Caribbean, Haiti and Saint Dominica, and all of the islands there, they thought they were in the Philippines. They were in India. So they misjudged the size of the earth. That's why it's called the West Indies, if you kind of think, because you guys have probably wondered why they're the West Indies, West India. That was where that name came from. So the Europeans now remember that Asia is at its height. The Chinese are at the height, and in the subcontinent as well. Europe, at that point in time, has now discovered its own little playground, because the Europeans have gone to Central and South and North America, seen the people there, and realized that they're 1,000 years behind in terms of technology. And so the European powers, but particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish, conquered. The conquistadors, armed with steel, horses, gunpowder, and what was the fourth one? Responsible for killing lots and lots of indigenous Americans? Disease, germs. That's what they had. And so they did. And so 95% of the indigenous peoples in North and Central South America all got killed through that part. A little bit, yeah. In fact, probably worse than the Americas, but maybe it might not be worse percentage. I'm not sure. I'd have to check, but something comparable anyway. Largely, you guys know how disease works, and in terms of vaccinations, in terms of being exposed to stuff. Europe had lots of plagues and lots of disease, and so as a result, over a period of time, your citizens build up immunity and pass that on, and so that taking those diseases to people that aren't exposed to them wipes them out real fast. And what do you do with the rest? Take some slaves. We need some cheap workforce. And so you can see with this history, how are we going to get workforce in the Caribbean? Well, to start with, to dig the mines, we'll basically just enslave the local indigenous people. And although, interestingly, those that convert, you can't have Christians as slaves. I think Islam's the same. You can't have, in theory, in practice, we'll talk about some of this, the way the British got around that. But in theory, it had to be indigenous people, and you would take them and have them as slaves. You don't have to pay them, and that's fine while you're pointing a gun at their head. And over time in the Caribbean, though, you guys would be a little bit aware that when we think about slaves in North America, they're not ethnically American, they're ethnically African. If we stop and think about that in terms of particularly North American culture. Why is that? It's to do with trade winds. As if you stop and think about it, as the winds blow from Europe to Africa, from Africa to the New World, from the New World back to Europe. And so what they would do over a period of like 400 years is you would take produce from the New World, so rice, sugar, things that would grow well in the tropics, coffee, cocoa, things that were very, very expensive, highly prized things in Europe. You get those, you take them back to Europe, you then empty that off, you get manufactured goods, you go to Africa, you swap manufactured goods for people. You have slaves, and then you take slaves to the New World. And you repeat that cycle of misery for 400 years. And it made Europe rich and Africans miserable as part and parcel of that. So that's how and where. And again, this, when we talk about, I guess, post-colonial, what's the word? I don't think angst is quite the right word for it. But there's certainly a lot of trauma, and that flows across hundreds of years. And we'll talk specifically about Australia in a little bit too, because you might be wondering where, given that we're talking about Australian law, where the British were in all of this. What were they doing? Because the British were quite late to the peace. So which one?
Around the 600.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the thing is with Britain, if you look at it, Britain and England, particularly England, it wasn't Britain until the 1700s for a very good reason. The Scots are terrible at running businesses. The thing is, they were late to the peace. It's not a very big place. It doesn't have that many people. And the remarkable thing about this, there was a point in time where the English started to really get into this thing. Well, they did try and have colonies, not particularly successfully. The British, as I mentioned last week, had a civil war. The English had a civil war in the 1600s as well. And so they weren't even playing in a whole bunch of wars at that time. But they had just lost an embarrassing, lost one of many wars. I think this one was with the Dutch in the late 1600s. And I might have mentioned that they, after the Civil War, there was a guy called Cromwell who won. Parliament fought the king. The king lost, got his head chopped off, and they ran and had it as a republic for years afterwards. The trouble is, Cromwell was a Puritan. He didn't believe in fun. No drinking, no dancing, no singing, no fun. And so and to make it even better, after he was looking sick, he went to appoint someone to be a successor. So if you've just overthrown this great, terrible system that is the monarchy, who would be the worst possible person to choose as your successor? Your own son. And so he chose his own son to succeed him. But after he died, a bunch of parliamentarians shirt-fronted him, and they brought back the son of the old king. They call it the Restoration. So we talk about Restoration in England in the late 1600s, because they brought back the king and said, please be good. And that guy was fine. He let everybody do drinking again, and so Charles III was known as the Merry King. But when his brother went to take over, James, there was one very, very serious problem. One, some might say, a defect with James. Anybody know what it was? He was a particular characteristic. He was Catholic. That was going to be, it doesn't seem like a problem now, but it was a real problem in England at the time. All right, and so he did this in secret. In secret, he converted to Catholicism, got an envoy of the Pope to come up, went through all of this stuff, but as people became increasingly worried about this, so he got shirt-fronted as well. And a bunch of quite brave parliamentarians sent a letter to a pair of Dutch royals. It was the daughter of previous king, I think, or niece or something, and her husband called William and Mary, a pair of Dutch royals, and said, do you want to come and be king and queen of England? And they said, sure. And they said, great, we have some conditions. Okay, and those conditions are laid out in an instrument. It's called the Bill of Rights. And similar to an instrument that they tried about 400 years earlier in England in 1215, where the king, terrible king. You notice John is a very common English name. They've never had any kings called John since the year 1215, because again, he was a terrible king, and they tried to stop him from doing things. All the parliament came together, the barons came together, shirt-fronted him, and made him sign a great document called the Great Charter, or Magna Carta. That was in 1215. The English in 1689 created the Bill of Rights. It's not really about individual rights. What it is about is limiting the absolute power of the king or queen from doing whatever they like. Those two instruments limit the power of the British monarch. Okay? There was one other thing that James, though, in all his naughty Catholic badness did. He did one other thing, and it's hugely important for the history of the world. He set up an organisation called the Bank of England. And it's important for commerce, it's important for contract law, because that, historians point, is the single point in time where England went from being a tiny little tin pot, I'll loosely say country, in Northern Europe, to start the spiral. Why? Because with money, the bank, we think of banks as a straightforward thing. You just go, you put your money in the bank, and later on you bring it out. And so what they said is, sure, put the money in the bank, leave it there for a year, and we'll give you 5% interest. Okay? The government ran this. Now this was actually something of a revelation as an entity. Because sure, big rich people could do it, but also poor people could do it. You could actually go, as a poor person, put money into something and have it guaranteed by the government. That's a huge thing. And so what the government did of the day, the king would then go, now it should just reconnect there. Hopefully it'll be back in a second. It'll come back in a second. Okay, so if you think about how governments make money, or at least how they did 300 years ago, what was the primary way you made money as a government? Tax? Yeah, what sort of tax?
Tax on the wealth that you have.
No, that's a bit tricky one to do. It's a tricky one because you've got to have accountants. There's not a huge number of accountants.
What you see in old movies that people used to give taxes of whatever you have.
Yeah, the peasantry. That is true. They did go through and do that and have poll tax. They would tax all sorts of things, tax the number of windows you have in your house because that shows how much wealth you have. But the main thing that generated most of the revenue, the economists. No, it wasn't property tax. It's actually excise duty, import tax. So you can appreciate that idea when you import stuff, government people would come in, put a stamp on it, and charge you 100% tax on it. It's also the reason why the English are terrible with coffee, because they insisted that coffee be made up and taxed the same as beer. So coffee had to be made up in liquid form and imported. Funny, eh? Just imagine that. You often wonder why the English were so bad with coffee. But that's where most of the revenue came from. So if you think about it, if you, as the government, are building boats, a couple of flow-on effects come from this. One, you're going and putting more boats onto the oceans. What does that mean? It means you've got more military boats to protect your merchant boats, which means a greater fraction of your merchant boats are getting through and not being attacked by other countries or pirates. What does that mean? It means that you've got more revenue because you're collecting more tax. And with that more revenue, what do? Build more boats and so on. And more importantly, you're building better boats. And so in the start of the 1700s, the English started putting copper on the front of their boats so they could turn better. They had better advances in cannon technology, better advances in sailing technology. And by the sort of 1720s, they're openly and actively picking fights with the Spanish and having wars. There's a famous war, I think it's in 1726, called the War of Jenkins Ear, where somebody famously went into the English Parliament with the ear of supposedly of an English ship captain. Oh, the Spanish did this, let's declare war on them. And they did. And so they declare war on the Spanish, who by this stage are well in decline as an empire. And they would pick fights with them and take their stuff. And that's what the English would do in the early part of the 1700s. And so that you've got this point. The other thing in terms of the economy is that if you're building boats, you appreciate. You've already been to the Reef HQ in the museum and had a look at the boat, the Pandora, the boat that's there. There's a lot of stuff on these boats. We sort of think that 300 years ago, practically all primitive. There is a lot of technology that went into those big ships. And a lot of different specialists are needed. You needed people to make pins, you needed people to bend the timber, you need people to do the rigging, you need people to do this, and you needed all of this aspect of specialization. And with lots of money, people were willing to do that, willing to start off their own businesses, supplying pins, bending timber, supplying rigging to go into these projects, to build these boats, all through in Portsmouth and Scotland and all sorts of places around the British Isles. And so that aspect of it, and this idea of self-interest, is one of the defining characteristics of this, because many empires up to that point would use labour, slave labour, to go through and essentially fulfill the work. And the British, by the 1700s, and then again in the 1800s, when you had the steam engine as well, had reached this point where people were voluntarily going and doing things. In 1776, a guy called Adam Smith, who was a Scotsman. You guys heard of Adam Smith? Who here has studied economics? Economics? The father of economics, Adam Smith, wrote a book, The Wealth of Nations. It's about self-interest. People don't make pins. They don't do these things. They don't get off their bums and do stuff unless they get something out of it. Now, again, if someone's pointing a gun at your head, the thing you're getting out of it is to live another day. Still not going to encourage you to work very hard, though. But if you, as an entrepreneur, get something out of it, there is an incentive, a strong incentive for you to work hard in order to achieve that particular result. Okay, and so that aspect of it, coupled with the steam engine in the 1800s, meant that the British were able to have this just a burgeoning, massive amount of commerce, maritime commerce. Why is this important to us? Because we're doing and studying contract law for the next 5 weeks, and it flowed from the laws that were created in the 17 and 1800s. And that came because the British had a lot of commerce. So we will find that there are cases that involve boats, admiralty cases, but also cases that involve a whole bunch of other things. And the reason why the British common law was preferred amongst ship owners as the place to go to resolve disputes, not because each side thought they were going to get the best result, but because it was the most well-developed system of law, and they knew with the rules of evidence that the British had that they would each get a fair hearing. So that's why maritime disputes were often done, even in unrelated nations and unrelated flags, through those systems. Okay, now, Australia. We appreciate, by this time you're reaching the mid to late 1700s, the British have got a lot of money and they've got a lot of awesome boats. What are they going to do with this? Explore the world, find new lands, go on scientific voyages. One of the things about the Royal Society, again, this idea of using competition, people trying to outdo themselves to create better and new and more advanced scientific inventions or discoveries. One of those was a guy called Captain James Cook. And Captain James Cook, this institution's named after, was a navigator and a map maker, pretty good one too. And so he had 3 voyages. The first one, I guess his most famous one, was to ostensibly map the transit of Venus somewhere off the northern coast of what they didn't know at the time, but off Australia. Transit of Venus, try and work out Earth's distance from the sun. You see Venus going across the sun, you've got to do it at a certain spot on the Earth. They worked this out. That was the main reason. The other reason was to try and find land. Try and find more land for the British Empire to go and take. So they did this. Cook crossed from east to west across the Pacific, and he came to the coast of New Zealand, mapped it around. A Dutchman had actually been there, a guy called Abel Tasman. The Tasmania state is named after Abel Tasman. He'd been there, but 120 or 130 years earlier. So no Europeans in between Tasman and Cook arriving came to New Zealand at all.
Why? It's too far.
Too far. The Dutch, they put on their maps, this land is death. The east coast of Australia, nothing lives there. Don't bother about it. That wasn't worth anything. And so they did send Tasman around the bottom, and he had not a great experience in a place called Murderer's Bay. And you could work out why it's called that. Tasman came to land and they got killed. And then he's like, stuff this and I'm out of here. So he only mapped the east coast. Cook went around and did a very, very careful map of all of New Zealand and then carried on to Australia. His boat ran aground in the Great Barrier Reef though. outside which town? Which town? No, it's further north. It's Cooktown. Cooktown is why it's named, because that's where the boat got down. So they were quite worried. They came ashore and spent months, I think, repairing the boat to get that, but basically to get the maps back to Britain. That was part and parcel of that. So Cook, he had 2 other voyages, but they're not really that important, and he died on the 3rd one. Didn't make it back. Got eaten. But the key thing to note here is that when Cook came to the east coast of Australia, he went, yeah, this'll do. This'll do. We should do something about this. We're going to proclaim this for King George II, one of the King Georges. And you put the flag up, you pick the soil up. And the British famously would go around the coastline, all right, map out the coastline. You get out your coloured pen. What colour is the British colour? It's red. Colour it in red and say, this is ours. What's the problem with that? Well, there's a bit of a problem if people already live there. Or at least so we would have thought. And so this land, it's actually the colony of New South Wales, was a boat of colonists. And remember, this was set up as a penal colony. Were sent in 1788. And so please correct me, January the 26th is Australia Day. Yeah. All right, and that is the date of the first fleet arriving in Botany Bay of colonists. All right, and that is ostensibly when this happens. So that the way the British common law works is that it follows the Westphalian rules. So if you go to a land and there are people there, right, you have to organise some form of treaty with them, or you take it by conquest. Either way, strictly speaking, either way, the laws of indigenous peoples under either of those mechanisms remain until you expressly say so otherwise. All right, this goes back to that Westphalian sovereignty, that Westphalian model I talked about last week. So when you go somewhere, the laws stay the same. Right, until you expressly go through and change them. That's an important thing. What happens if there's no one there? Well, you just receive British law. The British law becomes a law of the land, the common law, as adapted to the environment. That last part's important because the way land law works in Australia is fundamentally different to how it works in England. If you think about it, why would that be? Because there's so much more of it. There's so much more of it. The concept of a pastoral lease is alien. This idea that the Crown just says, yeah, you just have that farm, you just send your sheep on it, and you go collect them at some stage later. But you don't occupy it. You just let your animals run wild on it, and then just come and collect it. That doesn't exist in most other common law nations. And so, ostensibly, 1788, no one lives here. The law of Britain is now the law of the continent of Australia and Van Diemen's Land, which is what Tasmania is as well, and New Zealand, although New Zealand's a little bit tricky. I'll get back to that later. What's the problem with that? What the doctrine's called the doctrine of Terra Nullius, land belonging to no one. What's the problem with that on the continent of Australia?
It belongs to someone.
Which one?
It belongs to someone.
Yeah, it turns out there are already people here. But this is the problem. This is one of the great problems with the Australian legal system, is that in 1788, they said, no one lives here. We're just going to import or receive British law into this continent in entirety, as adapted to the local environment. Okay? Now, there were people here, and this is the really, really challenging and difficult thing. The British were aware of this. A lot of diaries between Cook interacting with Indigenous people and the early settlers interacting with Indigenous people. All right? When the British went to New Zealand, there were Indigenous people, and they made a treaty with them. A treaty at a place called Waitangi in 1840. Why? Because the Indigenous people of New Zealand had agriculture. going back to that being that indicia of civilization, the British looked at the indigenous people of New Zealand and said, they've got agriculture, they are a civilization, we will engage on an eye-to-eye level for to form to form a colony here, ceding sovereignty to the Crown of Queen Victoria in the case of New Zealand at that stage, in return for the protection of the British Empire. You are now citizens of the Empire. You have ostensibly the same rights. A bit tricky to get from New Zealand to Britain, but in theory you could do that, and some did. Here, that did not apply. It did not apply at all. Indigenous people in Australia were just ignored. So going back to this idea of trauma, in terms of civilizations, in terms of things, going back to the Caribbean and Africans and having that trauma of colonialism, Indigenous people in Australia have got the problem is that they weren't considered people. And that's quite a challenging thing for Australians over a long time to go and really deal with, because the colony of New South Wales, which was essentially the eastern part of this island, and later it was also New Zealand and Tasmania and the western side as well, that didn't split off into other colonies until about the 1850s. Again, Tasmania, then later Victoria and Queensland. Then you had South Australia, which was a big from north to south, and Western Australia later as well. Okay, and so in the 1800s, England and Britain would keep making laws, and we'll refer to some of those cases as part of this subject. They're still making law, but the colonies are making law as well. Sometimes you had to make laws in the local environment. So they did. They passed laws, and some of those laws involved Indigenous peoples. And so you had a series of cases occasionally would come before the courts, and the judges will say, it is long-standing law that Indigenous people are not a civilization. Indigenous people of Australia, so there is no pre-existing common law. They are essentially, this sounds awful, I think it's like fauna, treated under the similar sort of levels and things like that, which is extremely problematic. You could have two Indigenous people fighting, one murdering another, doesn't form part of the law. Not our problem. And so these things are quite problematic. Now, going back to a bit of realpolitik, Europe has lots of wars, and by the 1700s they're starting to have wars that were all over the globe. And so you would start to have these early world wars. In the 1800s, from the 1860s onwards, there was a real and genuine fear that a new rising power was going to come and conquer. What was that great new rising power? Nope. No, Napoleon was the early 1800s. The late 1800s? No, it's interesting actually. I'm interested. What do you guys think? What was the great fear? In the various Australian colonies, which was the nation you would say that they were fearful of by that stage? An up-and-coming Asian nation. Japan. There was a great fear. The Japanese were rapidly industrializing, and they wanted to build an empire. And there was a great fear that Australia is a big place. You ever tried defending it? A place this big? Doesn't work very well. In fact, there's a famous thing called the Brisbane Line. You ever heard of Australians in the room heard of the Brisbane Line? You know what that is?
No.
It's during the war, people in the southeast, and this is so insulting, they put a bunch of anti-tank formations and just said, stuff it. North Queensland, they can go to the Japanese. We're just going to defend from here down.
We're gonna?
We're just going to give North Queensland to the Japanese and defend from this line onwards.
Brisbane line.
Yeah, the Brisbane line. So just north of Brisbane, they put a line of defensive formation. It's a little bit insulting to North Queenslanders. Leave that aside. So late 1800s, a bunch of Australian colonies came together. Which one?
It's too hot. Come on.
Yeah, it's just not worth it. They can have it. What's up there anyway? A bunch of cows. So a bunch of colonies come together and they need to come up and map out a framework for really trying to both regulate and do things on the continent, but also defend the continent. All right, and so they had what's called the constitutional debates. New Zealand was actually invited to the first one, didn't come back to the second one. And they mapped out a document that was passed in both the UK Parliament, the Imperial Parliament, and amongst all of the states. Western Australia's was a little bit late, but I think they got it at the same time as well, that said on the 1st of January 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia comes into existence. All of the colonies now become states. All right, that's that point in time. So we think about Australia as a nation, starts at that point in time. That does not mean, though, that Australia separated from Britain at that time. A lot of people here, even those that were born here, still consider themselves part of Mother Britain and so on. And so our court system, the highest court, was actually not the Australian High Court. If you didn't like a decision of the High Court, you go to the Privy Council in England. All right, they stopped that for federal matters in the 60s and for, I think, state matters in the 70s. But I think there was some point where you could still do it all the way up till 1986. In 1986, again, the UK Parliament and the Australian Parliament passed what are called the Australia Acts. And that formally severs all ties with Britain. That was 1986. No appeals to the Privy Council. The British can't make laws for Australia. Australia can't make laws for Britain. That's it. That's the end of it. Okay? So that's the point in time in terms of Australian legal history. Those are the things you need to know. 1788, 1901, 1986, when it stops. And there's one other date. That one. 1992. Quite interesting. This is a case that went to the High Court. Very, very interesting case. It was a guy who was the gardener at JCU who would have conversations with the two history lecturers at the time, a guy called Nullius and Henry Reynolds. Conversations about his land up in the Torres Strait and the relationship between that and the Queensland government. And he's like, it's Mabo land. This guy's name was Eddie Mabo. It's always been Mabo lands. The government's never been there. They've never annexed it. They've never taken it. And Henry and Noel are like, well, it doesn't matter. Everything in and around this belongs to the state of Queensland, and they can make laws on it however they see fit. Okay, this went to the High Court, and bizarrely, and this would only have happened in that time. If that had happened any earlier or any later, I don't think that decision would have gone through, at least not in the same way. Actually, no, maybe now, actually. Maybe literally in the last 12 months would have been. But, so what happened, this case, there were 7 judges, so it's 6-1, and they said that, look, this idea of Terra Nullius, when in 1788 the First Fleet came and British law was received, the idea that people didn't live here is rubbish. People did live here. And when the British go to places and colonise, if there are people there, their law carries on until it's expressly extinguished. And so what we're going to do here in regards to this guy's claim is say, if you can make a claim and demonstrate a connection with your people all the way back to before 1788, you get a native title right to that land. And it's a very weak right. The Crown, and by the Crown I mean the state of Queensland or the Commonwealth of Australia, can come along, send in bulldozers and extinguish that. Or private individuals could have done that as well. So if individuals would come and move people off the land, even though it's a terrible injustice, you cannot make a claim under this. And so people lost their minds when this case came out, because you could imagine the High Court saying Indigenous people can make native title claims anywhere in Australia. In practice, though, it didn't really map out like that. But the government was faced with something of a dilemma. Do we pass legislation reversing this? All right? Or do we say, okay, we fundamentally agree with the High Court, what they've said, but we need to map it out. We need to actually have processes in place. We'll need to have like a ministry or some mechanism for people to go through and make these things, because that'd be very annoying if they have to go through the courts the whole time, all right, to go through and do that. And so they decided on that latter thing. They created the Native Title Act, passed it in 1993, and said, yeah, you can make claims for native title. And few years later, there was another group, which is probably the last piece of history that I'll talk about before we take a break, called the Wick People. They made an argument that pastoral leases didn't extinguish native title. In other words, when the Crown granted somebody a big plot of land where they roam their cattle through, that wouldn't extinguish native title either to Indigenous people that live there. One thing had changed, though. In the year 1996, the government changed. So it went from a centre-left government, Keating government, to John Howard. It was much, much more socially conservative. So they said, nah, we'll have none of this nonsense. So they said, no, you can't do it under pastoral lease. Okay. All right. I'm going to just pause there. I think we'll take a break for 10 minutes. Sorry about that. It took significantly longer than 10 minutes. That was a big lie, wasn't it? Sorry, you lost that time. Never getting that time back. What we're going to do, we're going to take a few minutes here, and then I'll come back and we'll just have a chat about this particular case. Hey, boss. Hey, yeah.
I was going through this,
hi.
the questions.
Oh, yeah.
And I could answer all of them, but I was stuck here. 3 meanings of common law.
It's really
what I have
annoying.
is like law made by judges. That's it.
Oh,
What
no,
else?
it's tricky. What it means is that we use the phrase common law to describe a system.
You have to speak a bit slow.
Oh, sorry. So you have it as a system of law. So the Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, India, kind of, Jamaica, South Africa, Nigeria. These are common law countries where judges are a source of law.
Yes.
So, and that is contrasted with places that are civil law systems where they have codes. Judges don't make law, they just interpret
I
it.
think that's Germany.
Italy, Switzerland,
Yeah.
France. And then you have places where things flow from religious law. So again, Saudis, where possibly
Yeah, but that goes into the civil law. How will I give three meanings of common law?
You find that in that system. Now we'll get back to the other two. So this is just it's really common law as opposed to civil law systems. All right, that's the first one. The second one is when we're talking about our system, when we say a particular rule comes from either the statutes or from judge-made law.
Yes.
We use that phrase there to say the rule is a common law rule as opposed to a rule from equity or a rule from statute.
Yeah.
That's the second meaning. That's as a source of law, a branch of law. I always get the two mixed up. The third one only comes up when we're talking about contracts and trust and those things there. When we talk about contracts in particular, I'll refer to equitable rules, common law rules. And when I'm meaning it just in the context of contracts for this subject, there are some areas where we talk about equity, all right, and they flow from equity. This area of conscience done by priests and so on. We contrast that with both statutory and judge-made law.
Okay.
And unfortunately, I use the term common law to describe both. It's a very, very dumb system, but I'll only do that and use that in the context of.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
It's
Everything was going smooth,
it's
except
the hardest question. I'm actually coming around. I might take that out.
don't
next
come,
year.
please.
I'm going to take it out.
Because when I was doing this, everything came back to my mind, whatever we had in the class. But three meaning of common, I was like, oh my god, I can't find anything. The only thing other than the meaning of common law came in like you have a law, but later on you realize that there was some mistakes in it, and then you correct it. That can only be the second definition of common law.
That's kind of describing the way judges make law in the common law system, and that a judge in a superior court, when they say something, judges in lower courts can't change it. Only the judges in this level and higher can go through and change that.
Yeah, they cannot come through changes. So
That's
I was
right.
wondering, I was
Those
thinking I'll ask him to remove
No,
this
it's not
question.
really separate. Yeah, I'll take that. I'll see if I can find it.
What we have this perception about the first two chapters is like The instructor is not going to give much questions from the first and second chapter,
No,
but
just
you
in the
end
test.
up having
It's in the
questions from
test.
that chapter.
It's in the test. Yeah, it is in the test. And those ones, look, those are really to try and help you because look, a lot of the test questions are very similar to this.
Yeah.
So those things there, if you can go through and do an answer to those, you do fine.
Yeah, I just wanted to see where I stand. So when I did these questions, I was only stuck in the three meanings of.
It's not a
common.
good.
The rest was all
Yeah, I think that's because that particular one, I was grown. Whenever I see it on slides, I'm like.
Okay, if you don't like
Yeah.
a question, you're
In fact,
not
it's
going
this
to
one
give it
here.
an
It's
exam.
this one here. In fact, I've got literally it's the slide here. Branch, source, and type. So
Is this from today's lecture?
this is today's.
Oh,
lecture,
I've
yeah,
read
so
the
I
old
got it
lectures.
done.
That's why I missed this.
Those are that lots of a mix of the two. I do try and mix between the two.
Type
But,
of legal system. Oh.
all right.
Yeah,
This,
at
this
least I know
stuff,
you're not going to give this question. That's
no,
okay.
I think I'll take it out. I think I will. I think we're going to go and take it out. This is
Yeah,
stuff-
rest I've all of them on my fingertips now.
Yeah. Oh, that's
I've been through this.
Is this where I should just?
Since you speak a bit fast, so I make sure I go home and I do your lecture again.
It's very
And I
nice.
listen to what you have said so I can put
I get told off for doing that. I've got told off. I'm trying to get better.
Actually, I also have this habit. I speak very fast. So when I went to meet my course coordinator, she was looking at me and then she was like, "If you don't mind,
Is that Sandra?
Can you speak a bit slow because I can't catch."
She says
your
that. She said that to you?
words."
Oh, yeah, nice.
Because my basic mother tongue is a language that is spoken very quickly.
Sure.
So because of that, I speak every language very quickly. And when I see you talking, I feel as if when I see you talking, I feel as if I'm talking. I'm like, oh, that's what my husband always tell me. Hina, talk slowly, and I'm like, why does he always say talk slowly? Because he can't catch my words.
I said
And I'm like looking at you like this.
a good friend of mine here. She's Rajasthani, and she has. Yeah, just I don't know.
When you reached
like
the state 1992, you were telling me something. I had the pen in my hand, and then I missed your words, and I was like,
I know too. That case there. That case there was a 992.
It was a case about the guy who wanted their lands back, and he went to the court, but he could not get them because he could not prove that he was an ancestor of that
Some
land, right?
people haven't managed to do it, and that's what you find because you need to prove it
Yeah.
all the way back. If you can't,
Yeah, and he
there's
wasn't
no
able to do it, so they could not get their lands, right? That's
this
what
one,
happened.
This one they did. This
They
one they
did.
did. This
See, I
particular
missed
one
the
they
point
did.
what you were saying.
They did. In some later ones they couldn't.
So he could prove that
He could
was,
do it, but that was the first time you were able to do that. Courts wouldn't recognise this as a rule. They made the rule up that day. And they said, sure, you've proved it. Sure, from this point forward, we recognise.
Okay, so he proved it. Okay.
Yeah, so he managed to not just prove the long-standingness,
Yeah,
but
but some
also
lawyers-
make an argument. The High Court says, hey, this should be a law. And they said, yes, that should be a law.
Okay.
And that's why it's very, very unusual. Citizens don't usually get to just go to the High Court and have the law changed. It's very, very, very unusual for that to
It was the
happen.
early time, that's why he was able to get it.
Yeah, that's right. So he was able to get that. So they went back and changed the law of
Yeah,
200 years. That's why it's sort of significant as a legal step. Right, here you go.
Can I purchase the textbook of the fourth edition?
Fourth might be hard. You can, if you can find it, you can use it. Most of the stuff's okay. When we do the Australia consumer law, you'll have to find that from online or somewhere else because that won't be the same in the fourth. The sixth onwards is fine, but if you got a real cheap one, don't pay them a lot of money for it. If it's only like $20, sure. If it's
30 bucks.
30, yeah, I mean you can. You'll probably be fine. It's just remember there'll be some areas that are going to be a little bit tricky. Okay, so just the Australian consumer law is the main one.
Help me with some other place from where I can get my textbook cheap. I've just come in
Oh,
this
sure.
Friday.
Yeah, sure thing.
I'm not really sure about
Put on Facebook. Go to Townsville Buy and Swap. It's a Facebook group. Townsville Buy and Swap. It's called. But they're pretty handy for people to go through and do that. The other thing is to contact the Law Student Society and the Business Student Society, both on Facebook as well, and get them to post a thing saying, "Hey, has anybody got text?" Because there are people from last year who are still in those groups, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, textbooks, sure, this much money." Jump on those. Those are probably the best places. Townsville Buy and Swap, the Business Society Facebook group, and the Law Student Society Facebook group. Great, jump on those on Facebook. So there you go.
Thanks so much.
It's a nuts. Hey, how you going? G'day.
Oh, yeah, you go for it.
No, let's go. I'm just checking my chat, that's all. I'm never too sure with these things how. Just jump on this one. Just trying to get the chat to work. Not sure why that's. Topic 2. Because everyone can hear me on the chat now, of course. Here we go. Pop out chat. Take this code here. Copy this in here. Again, everybody can hear me. That's fine. Here. Here. I did used to go through and sorry guys for everybody that's hearing this on the chat now. I did used to go and have a little pause function, but as it happens, it didn't work fabulous all the time. Let's see how this is going to go. There we go. Oh. Topic came off. Okay. Sorry about that, boss.
So, just a quick
Yeah,
question.
what's up?
What about the 4th edition of the book?
4th edition, it's the main thing is that it doesn't have the Australian consumer law stuff. That's really the key problematic area. The Australian consumer law thing was from about 2011. The 4th edition's from about 2010-ish. So if it's cheap, it's okay. So if you only paid like $20 or something like that, then it's fine. And look, most of the stuff is going to be fine. Just be aware when it starts talking about State Fair Trading Acts or the Trade Practices Act, you just ignore that stuff and we'll have to follow basically the lecture material. It's probably the best way to go about that. And you can get the particular sections that we're going to need to do the assignment stuff from. They're all free on the internet anyway, all of them. But it's just notes the Schedule 2 of the Competition and Consumer Act 2010 has got the Australian consumer law in it, and we'll have to follow those rules and the explanations about that, which mirrors the Trade Practices Act. If 10 years ago I would have done the subject and put both sections, the TPA, Trade Practices Act sections, as well as the new ones. These days we don't. We just leave them out. So just as long as you're conscious of that, you'll be fine. But all of the first 4 lectures on contract, you'll be fine. The lecture on tort, you'll be fine as well. So don't worry too much about that. Intellectual properties, touch and go, might be fine. I do actually emphasise some of the cases from about 2010, so there are some cases that might not be in your book for that as well. But for the contract law stuff, it'll be fine. I'll be conscious of that, only because some other people have made the same point, so I'll mention it as I go through. But if it was like $20, it's fine. If it's $50, don't buy it. That's my thoughts on that.
It's like 30.
Oh no, 30, that's like the worst number. It's like,
Yes, no, that's
I'd negotiate downwards if you get a chance,
I
but
want to bargain for it.
yeah, those things there. It's really not. It's $20. You could, I wouldn't pay more than $20 because it's just annoying because there's a whole bunch of things you're gonna have to do as well. And that's really the way to go, man.
Is
Yeah.
it like rush? Do I need to buy it like very soon? Or?
No. you'll be fine. We've got. I've done the HTML things. When you go into each of the topics, there's a little HTML thing, and it's like a step-by-step recipe. We're going through and do that. Most of that stuff's fine. I've listed readings, but over the next few weeks, I'll put more detailed information in there. Should be fine. Should be fine. Thanks, eh? All right. Okay, guys, we're going to do some. Alright, I'll leave him. Okay. Let's do this. Alright, team. Should we go while people are here?
Business law.
Yes.
For business law, when we put like 10 years old, it's okay.
10 years is fine. 15 years is a little tricky. Because basically there was a change in 2011 with Australian consumer law came in. And so for a few years we would put both sections of the Trade Practices Act and what the new ones were in the new Act. We started doing that about 5 to 10 years ago. Generally, so it's okay. It actually just comes down to this now. If you want to, if you get your book for like $20, you can use an older one.
Free from the library.
The library's fine. The other thing to note is that the library's actually got 4 copies of the textbook for this.
Yeah, that's just 2 days.
2 days. 2 days. Make note.
Yeah, check even. Yeah. We would like to print it. It's $60.
Okay, team. Alright, we're just going to go. I'm going to tell you. Alright, let's kick it off. Alright, team. So, a couple of things. I'm going to talk about the first 2 questions. Analyse and explain the differences in sovereignty stories between Australia and New Zealand. That's a little bit unfair because I haven't really talked about the sovereignty story of New Zealand. Other than that, team. Cheers. The only difference, the key important difference I have told you in the context of the history conversation tonight, what is the key difference in the New Zealand sovereignty and how that, I guess, nation came about as opposed to Australian sovereignty and how this nation came about? What's the key important difference?
Because the Maoris, they were recognized.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
The key difference is that when the law came to New Zealand, they recognized the local New Zealanders as a culture.
Yep.
And here they did.
Yep, that's right. What does that mean in terms of sovereignty? What do you have to do if there are already people there? You either do one of 2 things. What do you do? Either a treaty or conquest. All right, and they decided and you can appreciate times had changed. In the 1700s, or the 1600s, 1500s, you'd probably get away with genocide. You go to places, we think about this in Central America. Here you go, there's people here, let's just kill most of them and enslave the rest. You could do this. The times had changed, and they'd changed between the 1700s and 1840. By the time 1840s come around, genocide, in fact, and even slavery was no longer a phenomena. There was a case in the 1700s, Somerset's case. I can't remember, but I'm just going to check. I actually can't remember the exact. I think it was 17. I think I actually have this in a later lecture. Quite early, 1772. So that was 1772. That was Somerset's case. That was when the courts said slavery is not allowed anymore in Britain. Okay? And that's something, that was a slave that was purchased in like Jamaica and brought to the UK, and he escaped. And then somebody brought him up and said that I own this person. And the court said, you can't own people. And so he refers back to an earlier case, Cartwright's case, and says, the air of England is too sweet for a slave to breathe. But something of a fiction. Who knows of the concept of indentured workers?
Indentured?
Indentured workers. People from the subcontinent. Have you heard of this term? Maybe, maybe not. Well, I've got, my best friend is Gujarati, but her family live in Fiji. What happened in Fiji? You pay the family an amount of money,
And they give you the
their children, or they're usually stropping young sons to go and work for you. So those individuals are essentially have already been paid. And so they're not working for money for the time that they go off and do their thing for that length of time.
technically their workers.
Indentured workers. Yeah, so it's, I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of slavery.
Yeah, but it happens today.
It does. Okay. Indentured worker. So that's it. Yeah. Well, yeah, the thing was, it's one thing, and this is quite important in the context of Australia, it's one thing for people in the centre to make rules, like in Canberra. It's one thing to make rules about how things should be everywhere in Australia. What's the problem? People in Canberra, people in Melbourne, people in Brisbane don't live here. They don't know what it's like to live here. We don't know what it's like to live on Thursday Island. We don't know what it's like to live in the Pilbara. Or maybe we do, I don't know. If anybody's spent much time in these places. Mount Isa is fundamentally different from Toowoomba, and fundamentally different from Cooper Pedy, fundamentally different from Fitzroy in Victoria. This is a big country. And so these cases where abolishing slavery in Britain is fine for the citizens of Fleet Street, but it took a long time for that to filter in. In fact, a guy called Mr. Robert Towns. Anyone know who Mr. Robert Towns is? What's Robert Towns most famous for? Townsville. The city's named after him. And he would get workers from the Solomons.
You will get what?
He got workers from the Solomons, indentured workers from the Solomons. He was a slaver, essentially. So this city's named after a person who wasn't renowned for paying his workers either. And so you appreciate that, and this is a long time after 73 in Somerset's case. So it took a long time for this to filter down everywhere. Okay, that's the first thing to note there. So that's the key thing. So New Zealand, Indigenous people, the Māori of New Zealand had the indicia of civilization. It was a treaty. You cede your sovereignty to us. Yeah, there's some translation problems, and there's still grievances today, but those are recognised. But the key thing is recognition. That word is super important in law. Recognising stuff. Recognising the civilization exists didn't happen here. It caused a great deal of trauma as a result. Okay, and secondly, why was Mabo so important? Because it overturned that idea that people didn't live here. They talk about the doctrine of Terra Nullius. That's what it's called, Terra Nullius, land belonging to no one. It's a Latin phrase. Terra for land, Nullius for nothing, null. And you guys probably studied Latin, wouldn't you? Did you study Latin at school? Yeah, of course you did, of course. And so that's why, look, people say the doctrine got overthrown. It's not actually strictly true. There are heaps of places in Australia where people don't live. Macquarie Island, lots of places in the desert where people don't live. Terra Nullius still applies to all of those places. If no one's there, the British came and ostensibly took a lot of those places. Where nobody exists, sure, British law is received. But here we said that, look, people did live here, therefore the common law of England, Britain, Australia, takes that law and incorporates it. That's how common law works. It's flexible. It takes indigenous rules and laws, incorporates that as part of the system. Sorry? Common law countries? Yeah. The idea is that all of the common law nations flowed from the British. That's essentially the country where judges for a long time have been a source of law, and it's also known as the Unwritten Law. You'll see that phrase somewhere because it was just law that judges made, and would come up with these legal fictions that, look, this is how the law always was, and therefore this is what I'm deciding now. It's actually until only recently that you could actually have free reports of what judges had previously said as well. So that's, it's one of those kind of irritating things, because it's hard to work out what the law is. In theory, in the codified places, like Italy and places like that, you can see what the law is because you can just go and read the book. Theory. In practice, it's not quite that simple, is it? But in theory, that's what it is. Lots of books. That's the problem. Lots and lots of books to map it out. Okay, I'm going to carry on just really quickly. I'm going to race through the next few slides just because they're explanative and they're in your test. So I'm going to really quickly explain these.
Don't quickly explain them and go to the test.
Oh, they're in a test. Well, that's a formative test. I think it's an open book test actually, so you can just take your notes with you. And certainly take the slide material with you. I made the point about this test. The test is a little easier than you'd normally have a piece of assessment for a master's level subject. This is the last year this test will exist in the subject. I've been trying to take it out for ages, but
What would you replace it with?
with some piece where you guys have got to put your own thought into a written piece of some sort. Whether it's a collaborative, a group type task, which you guys as business students are much more comfortable, I imagine, doing group work. Law students are appallingly bad, like famously bad at group work, because it's a very ego-driven individual pursuit where they all think they can write better than everyone else. So famously, there was a sort of little quote the other day that was, "Welcome to university, where everybody is smarter than you except the 3 people in your group project." And so, they're famously bad. I did business management for my first degree. It's a core graduate attribute. Doing the MBA, it's a core graduate attribute, like collaborating, but we don't have any for this one. So this is the last year. But the test, in fairness, is easier. So again, it's little things like this that'll come up. So I just had a question about this particular part. It was in the questions from last week. This is a terrible definition of a phrase because it's used by lawyers in 3 different ways. So I use the term common law to describe the system, so systems that flowed from the British. Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain itself. Arguably India as well, although they've codified it a whole bunch of stuff. PNG, Nigeria, Jamaica. Which one? Ireland. The Irish don't like the English very much. They've codified it quite a lot. There's a lot of people in the world that don't like the English very much, including the countries that are very close to them. The Welsh and the Scots don't like the English very much. And so a lot of countries, as a result, have tried to codify things. What you find, though, when you codify, it has its own set of problems. People think, it's going to code the laws. No, because judges say a lot of things. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, and it is actually quite flexible. The common law system is very, very flexible. People can kind of guess what the rule is. Sometimes they're both wrong, and it requires another judge to tell them what it is. But often it's easier than trying to actually go through the text as a result. And certainly that's what the Indian experience is. Ideally, they would have thrown away everything to do with the British, but in practice, it's too difficult. It's one reason why contract law is still common law. It's actually quite hard to codify. It seems easy, but it's kind of not. All right, so that's the first one. So here we're talking about the type of legal system. Some countries we call them common law countries. This is one of them. Other countries are code or civil law countries. Switzerland, Germany, France, Italy are the big 4 of codification. Other countries essentially are just a variant of those. And again, it all comes back to Roman law. We usually use the, in fact, I've even got it as a separate thing here. The thing is that in theory, in China, everything's codified, but it's still responsive back to the party. So that if a law goes against basically what the party does and wants to do, the party gets their own way. Similarly with religious systems. In theory, all of the law is still responsive to the divine law, which is essentially run and dictated by a different group. Priests in the case of Saudi, or the Ayatollah, how does it work in I think Iran has something similar as well. I'm not sure. And certainly the party itself. And so that you have this extra system running over it as well. So this is not a hard and fast rule. PNG, for example, is a really good one. PNG has common law and code and a strong constitution and customary law as well. So Papua New Guinea has all four. So when you sort of say, what kind of system is it? Well, it's kind of a mix. But generally, we try to contrast systems where judges have power to make law, essentially. That's what we define as the common law countries. It's not a particularly useful phrase.
Again, so common law is?
Yeah, there are three different uses of the same term.
Three uses of the same term?
Yeah, the first one is it's a type of legal system, and that's contrasted with the other types. So we say Australia is a common law country. That's one meaning of this term.
So it's legal system.
Yep.
And then?
The second one is that common law is one of the sources of law. So you have legislation, where we get things from, or judge-made law, where we get things from. And we use the phrase, taking the law from the common law. That's it as a source.
So legislation
and common law and judge-made law. So there I'm meaning judge-made law. We use the phrase common law to describe that. This is a terrible question. I'm taking this out next year. Yep.
Why there is common law, civil law, common law, socialist?
No, I would have just said that there are two myself. But somebody, when writing a book, somebody made this. They made this distinction that apparently socialist law is somehow different. But I don't think it is. I think it's civil law as well. But I know.
Sorry, so back, just
Yep.
want to write it down. So legal
Sure.
system.
Yep. So type of legal system, source of law. So it's either, when we think of a source of law, it's judge-made law. We use the term common law. English is a stupid language where you've got the same term to describe multiple different things. It's very annoying. So I apologize for that because I will use these phrases interchangeably for this subject.
Which are the common...
I will use the numbers 2 and 3. I will use them.
Law and branch of law.
Yeah, I will use those phrases to describe judge-made law as opposed to coming from a statute that's made by Parliament. We will say this law, for example, the definition of the word possession in Australia comes from the common law. In other words, there's a case, it's called He Courte from 1984 in the Australian High Court that said possession means to have effective control over an object. I possess this when it's in my hand. I possess this when it's on my table. I possess this when it's sitting in my office back at in building 27. Right?
It's different because possession is not property.
That's right. But possession has a definition somewhere in our legal system, and that definition comes from judges. When I say it's a common law definition, that's what I'm meaning. I'm using the term to describe common law as a source of legal principle. So that, again, the definition of that word is a common law, as opposed to a word like one we're going to do later on, residency, which comes from statute, at least in part.
Somebody says law made by judges.
Yes, yes, I think I'll try and do that. I said, I'm going to take this out because I don't like the slide at all. It's confusing as hell. I have to give this to the first years, and they're just like, what the hell is this? The last one, the reason why this is in here, is when we're talking about contract rules, sometimes we're going to have principles that come from legislation or judge-made law. Sometimes we're going to have rules that come from this area known as equity. Now, the difficulty is that equity uses different principles and has different remedies. And so if I say duress is a common law action that is contrasted with undue influence, which is an equitable action. And very unfortunately, I'll use that and it has a slightly different meaning. When I'm using it in that context, I'm saying that it is not from equity. It's annoying. I know. I'm going to take the slide out. I feel embarrassed explaining this. By the way, I've been doing this for like 7 years with the same slide, and it's not my slide. And it's just I just think this is the way. Do you think I should just take this out of the test?
Yes, please.
I'm just going to take it out. I really think I can. I'm just going to make a note. I'll write a note in here. I'll take it out from the undergrads as well. It's just It's just so confusing. The downside is occasionally you're going to notice when we're doing contract law, I'm going to use the term interchangeably. So just, you have to leave that in the back of your mind. They're the last two I'm going to use. You can forget about number one at this stage.
Number one is easy.
No, mine is easy, yeah, but that's right. But that's not the,
The two and three that is annoying.
yeah. All right. Some of these are we went over last week as well. I got the chat going, by the way, as well. So again, from this point forward, when we're doing stuff, you should be able to go. If anybody's watching this externally, don't think anyone is, but if they were, you can chat and ask questions. Yes. Okay, what do courts do? Courts do these things. Yeah. Yes, please. Yes. Love it.
What is equity?
Equity. Oh, great.
Because like this is for me a different language.
It is.
Design background.
Oh, yeah.
So you say equity law, and I'm
This is one of the hardest things for the accounting students amongst us, which is most of half the class. Equity was an area that wasn't run by judges; it was run by priests. So you would go into the church. Yeah, go. You have to keep it close.
Please, I can barely hear him. Please.
Please. Okay. So let's go over this. This area of law, this idea and concept of equity, is to fix and remedy defects in the court system. Fix or remedy defects in the common law. So if there's a single phrase you can use, equity remedies defects in the common law. One of those defects, a great important rule, all contracts for land, for the sale of land, must be in writing. Okay? What happens if you sell your land and you don't have it in writing? So I've sold you my land, but we didn't sign anything. I've given you the money, and you've given me the land and walked away.
But there's no paperwork.
But there's no paperwork. What's going to happen? Well, yeah. What do we think? Let's put it to the class. All right, I'm going to put it to the class. All right, I've sold my land. In fact, an even better example, I'll give you a real example. I bought a house with my now ex-partner 5 years ago, and we paid half each. $300,000 house, we paid cash, half each. Okay, little house in Douglas, it's only in her name. So I put $150,000. Am I? Oh, we'll see. We'll see about this. I know, right? I know. And don't get me wrong. A lot of people have said that to me. Not many lawyers, but a lot of people have said that. What were you thinking? Hang on. You just put money towards a house and it's not in your name? What's going to happen if you go to court? And so, do I? Do I?
No, you get nothing.
Do I get nothing? What do you think? Should I get nothing for being stupid? No, seriously, that's actually a serious question.
I mean, don't they
Was it on both of you? On your ex-name and yours?
No, only in her name. I paid half, and only in her name. Yep.
Do you pay cash or
Yep. Pay cash, well, through the bank, but yeah, sure. Yeah.
But it's in her name.
Yep. What's going to happen?
You lose the money.
Do I lose the money? Do I?
No.
Do I?
In divorce, you get
With
half.
that? No, it's on divorce. Not married.
I think you should still get something because as per the law, if you're partners and you're separating, and then you have to.
Leaving aside the mechanics of the Family Law Act, so just leave that aside.
Donation.
It could be a gift. Could be a gift. All right. Do people usually buy houses for other people as gifts?
In the Middle East, they do.
Do they?
Yeah, when you have to hire
This is-
some money, you say it's a gift.
Oh, okay. Assuming that we. What about if I said, okay, guys, we just get this. What if I said, Okay, how about, given that this house isn't that expensive, and the next time we buy a house, we'll put it in my name and move the equity across, the whatever the money, because you guys are probably aware that for tax purposes, you want to have the house you're not living in have a large mortgage, and the house you are living in have no mortgage, because you can't claim a tax deduction on that. So what if I said, okay, the two of us come together, we'll put this house in your name, all right, pay just a little bit of stamp duty. Next time we buy a house, we'll put it in my name, pay no stamp duty, because it'll be my first house.
Need a contract, and then can
Well, do I need a contract?
Yeah, to do that, yeah.
Do I?
If you do that, yeah. If you do a contract, you will not lose. Because
Can you have a contract between two people in a domestic relationship? You can't. You can't create a contract.
You're not married, but you are not in the same.
Doesn't matter. It's a domestic or social relation. We'll do this next week. We'll do it next week.
What happened in your case?
What happened? Well, it's still ongoing at the moment, but I've got to say, I'm quietly smiling. The large reason why it's actually problematic, not for me, is because there's an area of law known as equity, and there's a part of equity known as trust law, and particularly trust through operation of law. So when you purchase real property, land, it's presumed that it is not a gift. So by default, you can ask the court to put the other person in the position of a trustee on it.
No, but isn't it like if you and your partner buy something together, even if you are paying for it and then you're separating, you have to divide it equally, right?
No.
Yeah, but they're not legally
No, not married. Not married.
They're not married.
No. And that's actually not the rule in Australia.
But I heard if you're partners for certain years, then it is considered.
There's a case, it's called Jonah and White from 2010.
You know the law, but you still did it.
I know, I still know the law. Yeah, that's right. I still know the law because there's this area of law known as equity. I know how the rules of equity work, and there's a curious rule. Well,
Problem like this, and
there's-
they can break the not correct.
that corrects defects that prevent injustice. Now, one of the real problems with this is the house has gone down in value. One of the curious mechanisms about this is that if I apply for a trust, it's actually the amount that I paid.
That's technically you will earn more than 60, more than half, because it's 300. But if you have the depreciation, it will be like 250.
I have to apply to
But
the court, but yeah.
You are paying for the nominal value of the money.
That's right. So there's an area of law. So it's the sort of thing that you might want to leave on the back of your mind, that equity remedies defects in the common law. In this particular case, I know the law a little bit, but most people wouldn't in that situation. And I have to admit that is something of a gotcha. You wouldn't expect people to go and buy houses and put it in there.
For a piece of something
Yeah.
that you don't own whatsoever.
Yeah.
And still
That's right.
get some-
It's the idea is that in equity you can separate the legal ownership from the beneficial ownerships. Do we know what that's called? It starts with T. When you separate the burdens and the benefits of owning property, it only exists in the common law systems, US, Canada, England, Australia. It's called trusts. And those people doing accounting amongst you, you need to know this because it's a big part of an increasingly large part of business. People running businesses under trusts. The reason to do that is that you can protect your assets. Because strictly speaking, with this house, and again, assuming at some stage that we resolve our dispute, me and my ex-girlfriend, but assuming that it goes into a trust, the beneficiary will be my child. I will be the trustee, so I will have legal title, but not the beneficial interest. I don't own the good bits, only the bad bits. I have to pay the rent, do the mortgage, do this, that, and the other thing. The good bits will go to my child at some stage later on. All right. There's a woman in Australia, a very famous woman called Gina Rinehart.
The richest one.
The richest one.
Pick up the kids.
She had some drama with her trusts. So just make note, the trust law doesn't work. It only works while everybody's happy and good and smiley and with everyone else. When the kids turn around and say, actually, Mum, we don't like you anymore. We want the money, which is what she did. So the kids, the greedy kids, just came back and they fought her in the courts to take all of her stuff away that she'd left for them. Because at the end of the day, what are you going to leave? If you're going to have kids, what are you going to do? When you die, what's the point? What's the point of having stuff, really? And that's something for you guys, the accounting people amongst you. when we get to bankruptcy, you'll see this as well. Trusts are an amazing way to avoid and escape things, provided you do them a long time in advance, which is why knowing the rules now is huge. Because if you want to do it a day before you're about to go bankrupt, good luck. The courts say, nah, you're creating the injustice. Equity will not intervene to save you. Anyway, that's how that goes. Okay. What do judges do? Those things. Adjudicate. They resolve disputes between parties. Two people come to court in our adversarial system. They fight. One winner, one loser. That's why going to court sucks. You're rolling the dice every time you go to court. And in terms of, particularly for those that analyze, I'm doing finance, which is some fraction you guys will be doing. That risk analysis is huge. That idea of having to have a calculated guess as to what's going to happen when you go to court. It's massive. Lawyers, when giving advice, will almost never pin things down to a finite number of or percentages or ranges. Why is that? Why will lawyers not give you a very precise answer?
Because they don't know for sure.
Because they don't know for sure. And if they're wrong, we get sued. We just get sued. We get sued. We have to pay for being negligent. Okay, courts have an interpretive function. In other words, they look at what the law is, judge-made law, principles of equity, and legislation. They are interpreting what the law is, and in order to adjudicate things, to actually uncover what the law is when people ask them. They don't do it of their own volition. Judges don't just wake up on a Monday morning and decide that they want to make new law. They can only do it when people come up to them. Law enforcement function. Curiously, judges have the power, a discretionary power, to send people to jail. What's it called? What's the power that judges inherently have to send people to jail who are disrespectful to them and or the court?
Because if I'm in the court,
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. People do that. People do that. People do that. Yeah. Sorry, what happens if you do?
You're held in prison.
Go and tell you this. He's got it there. It's contempt. Contempt of court. It also happens if the court grants an order, and we do this for a contract a little bit later on, some orders, injunctions. So if an injunction is ordered to stop you doing something, you can't chop those trees down until this goes to trial. If you chop those trees down, you're in contempt. When I was in...
Contempt falls under law enforcement.
It is the law enforcement function. It's really the main law enforcement function. They have an inherent power to do that. Look, the judges don't physically grab people and throw them in jail. They grant orders giving security and giving police the power to do that. And that's what they do. They have the power to go through and do that. When I did legal studies in high school, we went with our local MP to meet the Prime Minister. And a few years later, this guy, Trevor Rogers was his name, he had a business next to my dad's building helicopters for the US militaries, helicopter drones. And when his business went broke, went to court, the liquidators said, where's the plans for these helicopters? And he said, what plans? And so it went to trial, and the judge said, Mr. Rogers, please give us these plans. And he goes, what plans? To the judge. And the judge said, right. And but the former MP, he went to jail for 6 weeks. And then when he got out of jail, he strutted off to the US and sold his plans to somewhere else. But that is something that courts can do. They have the power to do that. It's discretionary, but they can do it.
And if the judge make a mistake?
You can appeal. You can go through and appeal that for contempt, but often they won't. Particularly if it's really bad. Usually it's pretty obvious when people are doing that. So like trying to threaten a judge while you're in the courtroom. See you later, buddy. Get him out of here. Lawmaking function, Mabo number 2. Occasionally, judges make law on the face of it. They're just looking at legal principles, throwing them together, coming up with something new. Doesn't happen often. Really quickly, this is revision from last week as well. Just the categories of jurisdiction. This subject is about civil law. It's about citizens. And really, we're not even worried about citizen versus the state. It's citizen versus other citizen. That's what we call civil law and contrasted with criminal law. We don't do anything to do with criminal law here. Good. All right, Queensland. All right, this is the hierarchy of courts. Oh, it's on the screen. Please go on screen. Go now. And in Queensland, we have a bunch of what we call inferior courts, the magistrates court, civil disputes up to $150,000, and summary offences. So that's minor criminal offences where you do not get a jury. Okay, the judge just determines it on the spot. Tells you what. The magistrates court. That's this one here. You do not like. So if you get a parking ticket, all right. If you get a parking ticket and you want to fight it, you go to magistrates court. If you have a civil dispute, and it's between if it's more than $25,000 but less than $150,000, you go to magistrates court. All right. If you don't like that decision by the judge or the magistrate, I should say, you can appeal it under Section 222 of the Justices Act to the district court. And people do this a lot, and a district court judge will appeal it. You can always do that by right. You do not need leave to appeal if the amount is between $25,000 and $150,000. So if you think the judge got it wrong, you can go to the next court. What's the risk of doing that?
You lose the money.
You'll lose. Well, if you've already lost, assuming that you've lost, the other side's won, and you're appealing it to try and win, what's going to happen if you lose again?
You lose the second and the first, but you can do that in order to take time.
It takes time, but you also have to pay their costs. You pay their legal costs if you lose. You can buy time. This is there. You can have matter stay, and people do that, exactly that. It's quite awful. If you do not like the decision of the district court, or if your matter was in the district court to start with, because it was between $150,000 and $750,000, if you don't like it, you can go to the Court of Appeal to appeal. That is 3 judges.
25 to 75?
If it's if you're in marriage court is between 25 and 150.
Yeah.
If it's less than 25,000, you go to this place called QK, the tribunal, somewhere, the one down the bottom. If it's less than 25. Yeah.
You know Peter everything, you know. They are going to the High Court now.
Peter, they're going to the Court of Appeal. Court of Appeal. Sorry, no, it's the federal court. They're going to the full federal court first. That's on it, because at the moment, that was this one here. That was the court where that was heard. So they will have to go there and then there. But and there's an important thing here. Going to the Court of Appeal, it is expensive, and going to the Queensland Court of Appeal and going to the High Court, you must have leave. What that means is that you need to demonstrate there was some injustice, demonstrate that there was some error on the face of it. So in other words, you've got an argument that could at least be heard, or it's an interesting matter of law. You don't by right get to go to the Queensland Court of Appeal. You don't by right. You have to seek leave. Now, the way it works mechanically, you usually the judge will just look at your arguments from the start and determine whether or not leave is going to be granted at the same time the matter's heard. Sometimes just for sake of expediency, they'll do the whole thing together. The same with this one here. QCAT appeals. When they hear your matter, when you pay your money to launch your appeal, they will have leave. They do not have to listen to your matter in these appeals jurisdictions. You have to ask for leave first. It means you need to prove an injustice could or has occurred, that there's a serious defect in law, that the law needs developing, like it's an interesting or novel case as part of it, or there's some sort of error. So injustice, an obvious error, or the law is going to develop in order to be granted the right to be heard in this appeals jurisdiction. You don't get it by right. You do get it by right going from the magistrates court to the district court. So a small matter you hear in magistrate court, if you want to go to district court judge and have it done properly, you do get to do that by right. You don't need to ask. You do have to pay costs if you lose, and people lose a lot. But that's how that works.
But if you want to take it from district to appeal,
yes, you need to say you need to ask leave for that. You need to ask leave for that and leave over here as well. You need leave for that one as well. So if you want to go from the leave, you have to ask leave. You have to ask. Please ask the appeals court, in this case the full federal court or the Queensland Court of Appeal. You have to ask them nicely to have the matter heard. When you're asking them, you have to argue there was some serious injustice, or there's on the face of it a defect in law or legal reasoning, or it's a novel or interesting matter of law for the court that's worthy of the court to hear. Because remember that judges can't choose the matters they're going to have. It's only things that come before them. So if there is a contentious area of law, the appellate courts are actually more likely to hear it in order to give them the opportunity to map things out a little clearer. Okay. Now, to go to the High Court, the same thing applies from anywhere, from the full family, from the Queensland or the full federal court, because there are only 7 High Court judges. All right, that's a finite number of people to work on all of the common law of Australia. It's not very many. And so they literally cannot hear more than a few hundred matters each year. They can't. Their caseload is restricted by the Constitution. And so the Peter Ridd decision, have you guys heard about Peter Ridd? Peter Ridd is a JCU academic who went, and it is appalling. I just read it again today. It's the worst. I'm on record here. It was in the federal court in front of a judge, and I've actually been censored for this, so I'm really, really careful about what I say now. I've already had a please explain from the uni, so I might just shut. Sorry for all the people listening on YouTube. I'm going to have to shut my mouth because I've been formally told off for talking about that case. So if you like,
hey, you mentioned it.
Go and mention. It's really bad. It's really, really bad. I got a really, really bad please explain from the head of media at JCU. So yeah, I'm on YouTube. So I'm visibly nervous about doing that. But you're more than welcome to read. There are 2 cases from last year. I should be, and that's what Clause 14 of our Enterprise Agreement. That's what Justice Vaster said in the federal court. The case, it's been resolved in the federal circuit court. Well, this one here. It's been done here. And so what happened was, I can tell you about the case, but I can't demonstrate much of an opinion on it. No, just switch the mic off. Yeah, good. No, that's fine. So a guy, an academic, the head of physics, went to the federal court and said he had an argument with some of his colleagues about the quality of marine science research. Okay, and a few emails went backwards and forwards with some of his colleagues, and he went to the media. He was on Alan Jones and Peter Credlin talking about stuff. And the university, senior university members sent him a bunch of things saying, what you're doing here is a breach of the code of conduct. What you're doing there is a breach of code of conduct, that's a breach of code of conduct, and this is a breach of code of conduct. And he said, well, actually, Clause 14 of the Enterprise Agreement says, I, as an academic, have to demonstrate some amount of academic freedom as part to do my job. So the code of conduct, supposedly, was in conflict with the Clause 14 of the Enterprise Agreement, the employment contract. All right? And so these things, and they terminated his employment, and so it went to the full federal court, and the judge was, in April last year, went through each of those supposed breaches, and said all of them are unlawful. And as a result, this guy's going to win, but I'm going to give it a few months for me to work out what the damages are going to be. Okay? All right, so he won quite comfortably amongst that single judge. But it got much, much, much worse because an email, and again, this is on public record, so what I'm speaking about at this stage, and we're very, very careful what I say, is on public record. You can go and read the judgment. It was released in September last year. And the judgment has a copy of an email that was sent to all JCU staff. And the email that sent to all JSU staff was outrageously critical of the judgment, and that the judge didn't take into account any precedent, that the judge didn't do this and didn't do that, a variety of scathing comments about that. And they misspelt the word judgment. First thing you learn in law school, the first week, judgment for legal judgment is spelt with only one E. If I'm showing my judgment to determine what shirt I'm going to wear today, that has two E's. A legal judgment that a judge writes is spelt with one E. So you absolutely plain as day that email wasn't written by a lawyer. Leave that one aside. Anyway, this email was replicated in September when the same judge was ordering costs. And the comments that the judge made about the university were just incredibly scathing. It said, look, Mr. Red didn't plead aggravated damages because he couldn't have worked out how just horrible the conduct of the university would have been after I released my judgment. And so as an institution that is producing the graduates of tomorrow, this behaviour is just beyond the pale. It's completely unacceptable. As such, I have to increase his damage awards as a result. Okay, because the university's conduct was so bad after the judgment was made. So they gave him an extra $90,000. Now, ironically, this is me putting my law hat on. The irony is, because that happened after the judgment, it probably actually shouldn't be included in the costs. So the incredible piece of irony here is that the university, who is appealing this case, is probably going to get up on that point, I think. I think they'll get up and they'll actually have the aggravated damages part removed, because if you think about it, when you go to court, at a certain point in time, a judge makes an order that says this person up to this point has been pleaded to get this amount of dollars. What happens the day later? I mean, that's sure, it might be something really bad, it might impact the reputation of the person, it might be worth getting dollar awards, but you have to go to court again. You can't just, from this action. Well, that's right, because they said you win back in April, but they worked out the dollar value in September. All right, and so the dollar value took into account stuff that happened after trial. And I personally think that the university will probably, incredibly, actually get up on that. I think that they will have that. I think that, well, they're not going to have to pay back the lost wages of $1 million, but the $90,000, I think they'll probably be able to appeal, just on a legal technicality more than anything else. It's kind of.
But then the union will pay $1.2 million.
Yeah, he still has to pay they'll have to pay $1.1 million to Peter Red, but that's the physics lecturer. Okay. All right, we're going to take a break again now, and then we're going to do stat interpretation at the end. I should tell you what, I'll just quickly run through these things here, guys. Just really, really quickly. QCAT, I put this in the assignment last year. It's not going to be probably in the assignment this year, I don't think. You've been to QCAT? Sucks. QCAT sucks. Couple of things to note. QCAT is for dollar disputes less than $25,000. Residential tenancy disputes, if you refused a green card, if you have a dispute with the one of the professional bodies, the medical profession, the legal profession, the accounting profession, you go to QCAT and hear dispute. The rules of evidence do not apply in tribunals, and it's strictly speaking, it's run in an inquisitorial mode. They can ask you questions. Judges don't do that. Judges wait for the two sides to ask the questions of the witnesses. In QCAT, they can ask you questions. So, did you read the document, Mr. Walker? I got asked. I'm like, well, yes, Your Honour, but it's not relevant because... But then they give up. Yeah, that's right. And they often do that. They try to split things up to be fair. And usually it's not fair, but that's life. The appeals division, if you don't like your decision in QCAT, you can appeal in a couple of different ways. You can go to QCAT, the appeals division, by right, and this is important for answering this question, if it's only an issue of law. If they've made a legal defect, like me, for example, I had a stationary dispute, and I lost. I was so angry. And it's like, well, I can appeal, but it's $400, and I'm probably not going to get the $400 back to be able to win back my $167. Yeah, that's the thing. I was so grumpy. But it was on an issue of law, which means you don't need leave. You can just appeal by right. Pay the $400, do the appeal. All right? If it's a mixture of fact, so some of the evidence that's come out needs to be reheard, or it's a mixture of fact and law, or just a matter of fact, you think that the wrong evidence was adduced or they've weighted things up differently, you need to ask the appeals division before you can have it heard. You have to have this leave to be granted. That's just a key thing there. The advantages of those things is that it's much, 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 much cheaper. Also note that appeals matters, it'll pop up here in a second, appeals matters in the full federal court, the full family court, and the Queensland Court of Appeal, multiple judges. If one judge on their own has already got it wrong, you want to have at least, when you're doing the appeal, best out of 3, sometimes best out of 5. That's how it works for appeals. So appeals, they will have multiple judges as part of that process. All right, let's skip. Okay. Let's skip. Yeah, just see whether or not we'll go and. All right. And so this
When you're doing the slides,
yeah.
can you be mindful of just let me show you how we're printing them,
Yeah.
if possible.
Yeah, sure.
Because this is this size. I don't want to waste more paper.
Okay.
So maybe we remove this, we enlarge this, we remove the picture, something that this becomes easier, or we can.
It's hard to see. Yeah, it's hard to see.
Yeah, it's very hard to see, but this is the easiest way to take pictures, or else we'll have to waste a lot of paper.
If
The
you
first one
like,
was perfect.
if you like, I'm wondering just how I could do that because there's a certain font size where it gets a bit small. Do you want me to see if I can do it as a document? I can just take them out because you can go save as a docx file.
Okay.
You can save as a docx, get all of them out, put it as a Word file.
Yeah, but this is visually
Yeah, cool.
easier. So I can
Yeah, I'll have a think. I'll have a think. Yeah, sure.
I'll show it to you as it works,
Sure.
and maybe I can do it for every session.
Okay. Just a couple of things to note, guys. We'll take a break in about 2 minutes. Okay, just really, really quickly. There is a rule when judges, I don't do it for, I'm not going to assess it for you guys, but you need to know this as a statement, just as a proposition. When judges make law, only appellate courts. So going back to the slide that we had just a little bit earlier. Which one of these are appellate courts? If you can read that, when it pops up. Which are the appellate courts in this little diagram here? Which ones?
Sorry, ask the question again.
Yep. Which only judges in appellate courts get appellate. So courts of appeal
Yeah.
get to make new law that binds other courts. Okay. On this diagram, which courts are those? Full federal court. Full family court, Queensland Court of Appeal, and the High Court. So there's 4. QCAT Appeals Tribunal is a tribunal, it's not a court.
Sorry, again, so the High Court,
Yep.
full federal court, full family court,
And the Queensland Court of Appeal, yes. So those first, all 4 of those courts can make law,
based on the
but it only based on principles that they think things are wrong. If something's come up, they are creating reasons for deciding. Subsequent decisions that come into courts below them are bound by it. All right, so the courts are bound by decisions which are higher than them. So a decision in the full federal court will not bind Queensland courts. Decisions in the Queensland Court of Appeal will not bind the full family court or the full federal court. All right, that's not usually the main problematic one. However, decisions of the High Court will bind all courts in Australia. That's essentially how that works.
High Court.
The High Court at the very, very top, if they make a rule, all courts have to follow it from that point. Yeah, I know, it's a pretty logical sort of thing. Yeah.
If some judge said that what he did before it's wrong, we can change opinion.
Yes, and occasionally judges will say silly things like, we think the High Court has made a mistake that's wrong. All right, sometimes that happens, and sometimes the High Court has to reaffirm to the courts. There was a famous one in Queensland, Phillips was the case, where the Chief Justice Gleeson really scathingly said, there is one court which gets to change the common law of Australia, and it's us, not you. we said this earlier, the law is this, you've said that it's not, we're going to smack down on you and say in no unequivocal, clear terms that says you were wrong to try and change it, take notice.
And this is why I remember also the university, at the second law, they're quick, but then you never say 100%,
Yeah.
because it's always argued.
Absolutely, everything's arguable, but you do have this idea that these things are there. All right, we're going to do, just the key thing to note before we move, we're going to take a break, is that only the judge's reasons for the decision bind the lower courts. Statements that they make that are hypothetical in nature do not bind. So if I say, here is this person that they have come before this court because they're both mistaken about a contract in a certain way. So for this example here, they've equally shared the mistake. We think in the High Court that when the parties are equally mistaken about it, they each bear their own loss. For example, this is an example, a proposition. If they'd also carried on and said, that solves this dispute, but in situations where both parties are not mistaken about the particular subjects that they're referring to, but they're two different subjects, then each party would also bear their own loss. All right, that's fine and all for a judge to say that, but it doesn't relate to the subject matter at hand. This is what's known as obiter dicta. It's a statement made in passing or a hypothetical. Judges making hypothetical statements about the law, what the law ought to be, do not bind inferior courts. Only the reasons that they have for deciding the particular matter in front of them at the time. It's very narrow in scope. So if they're going and saying the law of Australia, common law of Queensland, works like this for this particular case, only the reasons that directly impact facts at hand bind inferior courts. Hypothetical situations will not. So if they say, if the situation was different and this was a company instead of a natural person, or if the situation was different and it was this, that's fine. And judges can pay attention to that and say, the Queensland Court of Appeal said, in this alternative situation, this might be, but they're not strictly speaking bound by it. All right, so that's just a thing to note. The reasons for the decision, which in Latin is ratio decidendi, is the only thing that binds. Hypothetical situations or scenarios that judges explain to get to their reasoning do not bind inferior courts. And that sometimes can, particularly in older cases, can be hard to tell when you're reading them. But we're not going to delve too much in that. We are going to take a break though. Only a short break. Is 5 minutes all right? I'm just going to go and I'm just going to go to building 27 and I'll walk back and then I'll just carry on when we get back. If that's all right. So it'll be about 4 minutes. What you want, actually, if you do want, guys, what I do suggest you do in the break, if you are going to be in the room, have a read of this, because we're going to be doing this not long after I get back. I'm only going to quickly go through the slides, and it's challenging. This is challenging, it's also really practical. This is the test, this is actually the test of residency test. So have a read, and have a read of the scenario, and see if you can work out, because there are right or wrongs in this here. It's going to take a bit of brain power. Sorry, back in a minute.
Just so I can fill in
international students. Everyone says $40,000 per year. You know, he said, what is that? He said, what have you started? The research is in it's public money, that's part of the bill. That's we should change. Hey, good, and you?
This is my WhatsApp. I'll send you my number. I don't know. This is signed. This is on the following. This is on the what do you call it? Study session. Assignment.
Wait, this one?
Yeah, this is on assignment 2, so seminar 2. We have this, so these are cases that we need to solve. You seem so excited that you didn't see it, it's okay. But I don't know, I was waiting for him to say something, but now he's mentioning that it's a homework. I read it, but I didn't understand. Yeah, it's very hard for me. Although my sister did it the other day, and she was telling me this is the easiest thing I've done. I keep telling her I'm struggling. I can do your marketing if you tell me
it's like more or less. And the fact is, now I have to learn with the English, but if I close my eyes, I say, just in Italian, and I don't know because in Italy, you see the it is the book. Okay, business law is like this. Yeah. In Italy, you know, like the prayer, you pray God, that's it.
if you're studying what, anything?
Law, you study law, you
This is like a
yeah, it's all philosophy, I get that. I don't know, it's always like between the ontology and the Italy's working at the back. I don't care if I someone the fight them. You know. Yeah, I hate when they do that, it's time.
I hope I don't get to listen to everything.
I was just asking.
Beside my computer check, there is a gap somewhere.
Because I know that push it down.
How is it How is it yesterday?
Yeah, it's just because I'm That's it. Yeah, he's told me. The common one is expression.
You have to present it just now. Why first? You have to present it in the you have to submit it online. You know that, right? You are going through all this.
No, Yalamanchi. Yeah. So he has Shiva, Krishna, Yalamanchi. Shiva, Krishna is not Terra. No, is it Terra?
So I noticed that when we went to the case study,
Are we going to do this, or are we supposed to do this on our own?
Well, it's a combination. I'll give you guys some guidance, and we'll do some of them, and then the rest, okay, so we can do it at a later stage if you like. I'm just going to give some explanation on the interpretation steps. Okay, I'm going to kick it off, even though people aren't in here. We've had 10 minutes. All right, I'll give it 10. All right. Couple of things. Statutes. So Parliament-made law is the most important law. Why? Because the... Okay, yeah, otherwise it doesn't work. Yeah. There's not many people. I'll give it another 10 seconds. Hang on. All right. Here we go. So, the answers to the test. Question 1, C. Question 2. All right, stat interpretation super important in law. This is where the most important form of law flows from the clearly expressed will of Parliament enshrined in properly passed legislation. And the starting point when reading it is the words themselves. So it seems like a really dumb thing to say. When you need to do stat interpretation, start by just having a read. So what I'm going to do is, while I'm explaining the slides here, we're actually going to go through and read the problem. Because you see what the problem here, this is on the third page, where it's got a statutory rule. This comes from section 6, subsection 1, of the old Income Tax Act. It is the definition of Australian tax resident. So to be a resident within the meaning of the tax legislation, it means, and I'm going to read this out, resident means a person other than a company who resides in Australia and includes a person whose domicile is in Australia, unless the Commissioner is satisfied that the person's permanent place of abode is out of Australia. Or, notice that it doesn't have the word or, that's implicit in the way that the sentence is structured, who has actually been in Australia, continuously or intermittently, during more than 1/2 of the year of income, unless the Commissioner is satisfied the person's usual place of abode is outside Australia, and that the person does not intend to take up residence in Australia. And the definition of person also includes a company which is incorporated in Australia or which is not incorporated in Australia, carries on a business in Australia, and has either its central management and control in Australia or its voting power controlled by shareholders who are Australian resident. Okay? Quite a lot to unpack there. It's not in the tidiest of senses, but that is the law. That is the way this particular statute has construed residency. It's actually common across most jurisdictions, by the way. They have a test very similar to this. So I've got some other statutory and common law rules below that you read with this section. When you're trying to determine something.
Domicile means is a place where you're born, right?
Well, have a look.
The domicile thing.
Done. Henderson. That's actually an English case. But so the English House of Lords explained what that word means. Remember before I used the word possession, and I said that it flows from the common law because judges worked out what that word meant. All right. So the starting point here, and this is a sort of a basic guide of doing statutory interpretation. I actually prefer the next slide. This I think is the cleanest way of doing stat interpretation, in my opinion. The text is a little bit fine, so I apologise in advance. And it's kind of similar. I've just broken it up into 4 chunks. And the reason why I've done that is because when I had the first years, I said to them, just do the first 2 chunks. Don't worry about the 2 chunks after that. When we're doing the assessment for this, almost certainly the same things are going to apply. I'm not going to expect you guys to go beyond the common law definitions into other things. And the reason for that, when you're reading it, start with what the ordinary words mean. All right? What do the words ordinarily mean? And by that, what do they mean to you? That really is the way that you go about doing stat interpretation. And you're going to think, wow, what about dictionaries? Okay, got another? Dictionaries can be used to confirm words. So judges confirm meanings, but they don't go to the dictionary to get meanings. That's an important distinction. Start with what you think the word means. What does the word mean to you? That is the starting point when you're reading statutes. The ordinary meaning is what you think the word means. You can confirm that by going to the dictionary, but importantly, dictionary makers don't make law. Parliament does. Okay, so there's that idea of when trying to work out what words ordinarily mean, just think what they mean in your head. That's fine. Literally start with that. Now, this key thing here for these first 5 parts is when thinking of ordinary words, it's trying to reach step number 5, which is a logical model. So that is taking all of the ordinary words that are used, including words like and or, includes and means, shall and must. Those words, powerful words in terms of interpretation, and try to work out what it is that this thing actually functionally does without looking for definitions elsewhere other than what you've got in front of you. Okay, so that with some statutes, for example here, when we look at these cross-reference statutes, there's one important statute that you have to read at the same time as all other statutes, the Acts Interpretations Act. And so this one down here, where I've got AIA 1901, that's the Commonwealth Acts Interpretations Act, Section 2, capital C, the definition of the word person in any Commonwealth statute includes companies. Well, I mean, it doesn't say, it actually says includes bodies, corporate, and blah, 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 blah. It's complicated and long. Essentially, that's what it means. Anytime you see the word person,
It could be a human being or
Yep.
it could be a company.
yeah, unless the context clearly means one or the other. So, for example, the person's arm. A person having his or her arm chopped off is compensated with $100,000, right? Clearly that can't mean a company in the context, but by default, a person infringes this act by doing this thing means companies or natural people, okay? And that is just a statutory rule incorporated into the interpretation of all statutes, because that's what Parliament said in the Interpretations Act. All right, now, it is very common, and we're going to do some of these for your assessment actually, that we look to interpretive cases. What that means is that a judge has gone through a statutory rule like this one and explained it. What this section is trying to do is to define residency, and there's 4 limbs that it's got here. Residency for natural people can either be under the ordinary definition of resident, which is 1A, a person who resides in Australia. Because that sounds a bit silly, doesn't it? Resident means a person who resides. It's actually quite a common thing in statutes for a word to say this word means, and then use the ordinary word as part of it. All they're saying is start with what you started with. So that if we're changing the law, and this word meant something in the common law, it stays the same. If there are other cases that have worked out what the ordinary meaning of resident is, they just stay the same. You can use that definition. And here, that's actually what you do as part and parcel of this. It's got, here, the ordinary definition of resides is essentially the same as the dictionary definition. What does reside mean to you?
Someone that lives.
Lives. Yeah, you lives. You live in a certain place. You call it home, for example. And sometimes, though, when we're thinking of the ordinary definition, we start to use other words. It's your place of abode, or it's your place of accommodation, or it's your the permanent place that you stay, or it's you're using those words, and then you look down and realize, you've actually got other words here that are defined later. So you have to be a little bit conscious of that. But we just start with ordinarily what that means to us. That is the first definition. And tax residence, if you stop and think about it, if you step back from this, what is the Australian government trying to do, or Parliament trying to do when it passes this rule? If you're a tax resident, what does that mean?
If you are a tax resident,
Yeah?
what does it mean?
What does it mean in the broad sense? What does it mean? To be a tax resident, what happens?
Spent more than 6 months here, you pay.
Yeah, no, that's a definition of whether you are a resident. But what's it mean? If you are a resident, what do you think it's going to mean to you? What's going to happen to you if you're a tax resident?
Pay tax.
You pay tax. What does the government think about that? That's a great thing. Yes, we want as many people as possible to be residents of Australia. We could pass a law that said everybody in the world is a resident of Australia. We would, but we can't. Other countries don't like that. But it's quite common for a person to be considered to be tax resident in multiple places. How do we resolve that? International law. You have double tax arrangements between nations to try and resolve these disputes. Okay? So here, we're trying to set this as broad as we possibly can because we want people to be paying tax in Australia. So, yes?
The definition over here, resident means a person, that's part A, and part B, a company.
Mm-hmm.
But part A says a person other
Yep.
than a company.
Yes, I know. Yeah, and that's it. So this bit where the part A and the sub 1 and sub 2 is referring to natural people. So it's a person other than a company, and who satisfies at least one of these things. And part B is the test for companies. When you guys study tax, for those who would probably do that next year, usually you actually do them in separate parts of the course because the companies one's a little bit tricky. We're going to do it all now though. But these cases below, Applegate, Jenkins, Henderson and Hammond, these are the actual cases where they looked at, and essentially the courts have defined what those words mean. So the word permanent is not forever. Not forever, it's not logically forever. But it's not temporary. It's basically the opposite of temporary. That's what they're trying to say there. An intention to return to Australia in the foreseeable future to live does not prevent them from having a permanent place of residence elsewhere. In other words, going to Vanuatu for 3 years on a contract, all right, when you go, that is considered to be permanent, even though at some stage in the future you might intend to come back, or you might not. But you can still fall under the idea of it being a permanent place elsewhere. It's not forever. That's what they're meaning. That's what the court said when they tried to interpret what that section meant. Temporary is the opposite of permanent. Domicile flows from citizenship law. You get a domicile when you're born. That's where you're from. And the place of abode is where you hang your hat. This is what courts and judges have said. Okay? Now the challenge, flip the page. This is the challenging part. Now I'm going to challenge you guys. I'm going to spend a few minutes on this, but you are going to have to do, let's say, this in your own time after. Because, a little bit of reading, 3 children and 3 companies that she's involved with. So we have to work out whether they are Australian tax residents for the 2019 tax year. When does the 2019 tax year end?
June.
June, which year? June 2019. So that's right. So remember, you end the tax year in the middle of the calendar year with the same number in Australia. So Bianca, the daughter, born in PNG. So what's her domicile? PNG. Unless it says later on that she's changed, but it doesn't. Lives with her father in Moresby, that's the capital of PNG. Most of her life, never visited Australia until she arrived on the 1st of January 2018. She returned on the 1st of February 2019. Right, so what's the relevant period that we care about?
30 days.
It's not 30 days, because if you think about it, the middle of the year, in the middle of 2018, on the 1st of July 2018 through to the 1st of February 2019. Is that more than half the year?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is. So if we go back, we think about the logical model of this, all right? We know that she doesn't ordinarily reside here. She lives in PNG. Ordinarily, her house is PNG. We're not concerned about that. So she's going to fail this part A, all right? But it also includes a person with a domicile in Australia. Is she domiciled in Australia? No. So we're not even going to have A1. What about A2? Has actually been in Australia, continues intermittently, more than half the year, unless the commissioner is satisfied that her usual place of abode is outside Australia, and she does not intend to take up residence in Australia.
So she doesn't fall under resident.
But under that definition, who reckons she's a resident?
She's a resident.
She's not a resident.
Who reckons she's not a resident? Under that definition, it's definitely the second. Why? Because she doesn't ordinarily reside within the ordinary meaning of it. The house in PNG, she's come to stay with her mother. But does she fall under part A1? Domiciles in Australia? No, because she's PNG citizen. She's only a temporary resident to Australia. And then you've got part A2, subsection 2. Actually been in Australia during half the year? Yes, that's true. Unless the commissioner is satisfied that the person's usual place of abode is outside Australia and she doesn't intend to take up residence in Australia. So both of those two things have to be true. Does she intend to reside in Australia?
No.
Doesn't look like it, although her residence is at the time when she arrived, but it doesn't look like it here. And Is a usual place of abode outside? Arguably it is. It's in PNG. So arguably here, she is not going to be a tax resident. Vanuatu. Vanuatu is a series of islands in Melanesia. It's a country.
So it's not in Australia.
No, it's a country, separate country. In fact, all of these cases, oddly, are actually about people going to Vanuatu. With Jenkins and Applegate, the two famous ones. It's a person in Australia going to Vanuatu. Two different people. And when you guys said,
Is she supposed to be or she not?
she will not be. Reading that statute, she's not ordinary reside, so Part A doesn't apply. Then you look at Part A subsection 1 and Part A subsection 2. Why does 2 apply? Yes, she has actually been in Australia more than half a year, yes, unless the Commissioner is satisfied the person's usual place of abode is out of Australia and she doesn't intend to take a residence in Australia. So those things there, assuming that both of those points are true, which they appear to be on the facts, that the 183-day rule, which is what we call that half the year exception, won't apply. It actually won't apply if those two things are true. So this is trying to go through. Yep.
What was the first one answer?
The first, that's the first. That is Bianca. Asha is a tax resident, just because she satisfies all of those things. That's not part of the question.
She's a taxpayer, but what about the kids?
We're only looking at the kids. 3 children, and we're looking at the 3 companies. Yeah. So you need to work out whether B, C, D, E, and F, and G are kids. Yes.
If someone stays more than 7 months or 8
Yeah.
so we have to pay
Have a look. What's remember, paying tax and being tax resident are 2 slightly different things. You are taxed. You have to pay tax if you are a resident. All right. And again, if you're a resident in 2 countries, there's a double tax arrangement to work out which one you have to pay to and from. But the key thing here, and look, I'm not going to delve too much into it, is we're just trying to determine whether they are a resident or not. There are consequences. Australian residents pay tax on your worldwide income, and you get offsets for tax that you paid elsewhere. The thing is, in Australia, the top tax rate is very high. So people don't usually want to be Australian tax residents, except that the bottom tax rate is very low. The bottom tax rate for $18,200 is 0. The top tax rate for every dollar you earn above $190,000 in a year is, I think at the moment, it's 48.5. 48, it's around about 48 cents to the dollar. It's almost half of what everything you earn. Some might say not enough. Hey, you're European. You guys know all about top tax, except not Southern European. You guys don't know much about the tax. So, Italy, Greece and Italy are famous in their taxes. So it's okay, person number 2. Chandra, born in New Zealand. So it's going to be the domicile. Moved with the mother to Australia in 2010, but is solely a New Zealand citizen. It's a key piece of information. So her domicile stays New Zealand. Works as a geologist. Moved to Vanuatu to do oil exploration. 1st July 2017. The contract's for 12 months. The option of extending another 2 years. Okay, that's important because we're trying to work out whether that's permanent or not. Bought a house in Brisbane in 2015, has rented it out, put her furniture in storage at that time. 1st of October 2018, quit a job, returned to Australia to care for a sick mother, didn't return to her own house. And then in February 2019, she departed Australia to take up a 2-year contract in Saudi Arabia. Go back to the statute. What is it? I don't know. Let's follow the statute. Is she ordinarily a resident? In other words, does that subsection 1A apply? A person in the company who resides in Australia? You reckon ordinarily she is?
Well, she bought a house, she moved with her mother, she worked there.
Yeah.
She's a geologist in Australia until she got a contract to...
Doing oil exploration? Exploration geologist? Do you think she ordinarily is a resident?
No.
Is that where she lives? People ask you, where do you live?
With her mom, not in the...
That's there. How many? She was only when she went back to see her mum for 3 months, didn't she? 1st of October, quit her job.
No, she moved with her mother to Australia in 2010.
Yes, yep. And then she's gone to Vanuatu. And the question there is that...
In 2017.
Yep.
That was 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
So after 7 years of living in Australia...
Yep. So as a 24-year-old, yep.
Yeah,
She's moved to Vanuatu for
yeah,
12
she had
months.
a 12 months contract.
Do you reside in a place ordinarily if you would live there for a year? Or do you reside in a place if you'd lived there for 3 years? This is where law starts to get really tricky, because you have to start to make some value calls.
She's not a resident of Vanuatu, she's a resident of Australia.
Ordinarily, yep. Remember, we've got two things that are going on here. We've got the ordinary definition, which is just what the word means to you, where you live. It's the ordinary meaning, but that's not the same as the statutory meaning. The statutory meaning is governed by the statute. This is the law.
Yeah.
All right? The law includes the ordinary definition. So if you reside in Australia, then you're going to fall under this test. So ordinarily, if you live there, if you live in Australia, you're going to be a tax resident, right? But also, this word includes widens that definition.
So from 2010 to 2017, she was a
Yep,
resident.
absolutely. Yep, but we only care about the tax year, the 2019 tax year, from the 1st of July 2018. That's ordinarily she's probably not. Arguably she's gone to Vanuatu, probably, maybe for 1 year, but probably for 3.
But she left on Feb 19.
She lived in 2017, did she?
No.
No, works as geologist.
She has to pay the tax of 2019, right?
We're trying to work out whether she's a resident for the 2019 tax year. So she's gone in middle of 2017 to move there, all right, for however 2 years, and the option of extending for another 2 years. The contract's for 12 months, and so she has...
For 6 months.
She was living in 2017, but she left in 2019. We want to see if she has to pay the tax of 2019, right?
We are trying to determine where she is a tax resident for the 2019
from
tax
October
year.
to Feb, it's 5 months. So it's not even 6
She's not
months.
supposed to be, right?
Okay, hang on, let's stop and think about it. Remember, it's an exercise in stat interpretation. What does the statute say? So she has been, ordinarily, she probably isn't a resident within the English, the ordinary meaning. All right, so that subsection A is probably not going to apply, but it also includes those with a domicile in Australia. Is she domiciled in Australia?
No.
No, she's a New Zealand citizen. Has she actually been in Australia continuously or intermittently during more than 1/2 the year of income?
Well, at the beginning, yeah.
Has she been for the what's 1/2 of the what's the relevant year of income?
No.
The 1st of July 2018 through to the 30th of June 2019. Has she been there for more than 1/2 of the year?
No.
No. So therefore it's not going to apply. Therefore, assuming that she's not ordinarily resident, which it doesn't seem to be, because she's extended her contract, looks like she's going to be there for 3 years, she's not going to be considered a tax resident of Australia. And that's just following the rules. Yeah, so it's jumping through the hoops, eh? It's hard, eh? Because you have to justify.
At times,
Oh, yeah.
at times we can't.
And then you have to be careful because, you know,
At
there's
times it's hard to put it into words.
Yes.
But you know that this person doesn't have to pay tax or have to pay tax.
Well, the thing is, it's not about paying. You have to pay tax somewhere. People have to pay tax somewhere. And remember that if you are not a tax resident, it means that you have this thing called withholding tax. So Australian sourced income, they will take a chunk out of it. And because you're not a resident, the Australian government's going to keep it. Don't get me wrong, governments are very good at stopping people from moving income wherever they feel like it. They're quite good at doing that. Not perfect. That's why it's really quite nice to go to the Cayman Islands on holiday. But that's where really, it's not a case of not paying tax. It's not quite the same thing. People pay tax somewhere. Okay, D. Oh, how are we for time? Oh, we're going to run out of time. All right, I suggest with these, that's that style of going through and doing it. So I just need to quickly talk about the last stuff in the next 10 minutes. But that, I wholeheartedly recommend you guys go through as an exercise and bring it in next time. Okay? Please do that. I'm going to quickly talk about the last stuff because this is assessed. So this is mechanisms of statute. I'm not going to talk about syntactic presumptions, interpretation. I am going to talk about this. All right, not worry about this. I ain't going to talk about this because this is stuff you're going to be assessed on. All right. This is an umbrella term to describe ways of staying out of court. Okay, and it ranges from the very informal, just negotiating with the other party, to the very, very formal. Arbitration is essentially just like a court. Just like a court, it has these things. Sometimes you even follow the same rules of evidence. Very, very formal. but it's designed to try and keep people out of court. So these are ranged in terms of formality. Negotiating, just negotiating face-to-face with people to try and avoid going to court. This is in the civil sphere, not the criminal sphere. You don't get to negotiate with a judge to not go to jail. That's not how that works. Mediation is it's kind of the same thing as negotiation, but an independent, impartial, non-knowledgeable third party. There's usually a person who's not usually an expert on the area, is trying to facilitate the dialogue between the parties and people, not so much to get involved. Whereas conciliation is where you usually get somebody who's actively trying to get a result. Mediation is hands-off, conciliation is hands-on from that third party. They're still neutral. Usually they're paid for by both sides or by the government. That's the idea, is that conciliation, we want to get a result. Mediation, we're going to try and get the parties to have a meeting of minds, sometimes thrash their ideas out. Sometimes you can actually have situations, particularly with family type situations, where it turns out that people don't actually care. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not just about trying to argue about money. Sometimes one person wants particular assets or an apology or a demonstration that they were right in some way, and the other side just wants the money, or vice versa. Sometimes you can actually negotiate and mediate these things with a third party to get that result. Expert or case appraisal is where both sides agree to show their respective legal and factual arguments to a third party, and that third party, who has expertise in it, goes, if this goes to court, you're going to win, you're going to lose. That's essentially how that works. So you guys can carry on. That's not binding on either of the parties, but it can be a really useful mechanism, because sometimes people are completely blind in their own world as to what their position is. And that can be, particularly if it works very strongly one way or the other, that can be a very, very powerful way of resolving disputes. Industry-based is if some industries have particular boards that are set up to resolve disputes directly. You have to go through those before you can go elsewhere doing it. And the courts in some jurisdictions, and certainly things like QCAT and stuff, insist that you do ADR stuff before you go to court. So if you want to go to QCAT, first you have to go to mediation, or at least demonstrate that mediation was futile or the other side didn't turn up. You can't make people turn up. Only the courts can make people turn up. And finally, arbitration, which again is mandated in a variety of settings, particularly things like employment and admiralty cases. The sides must go and attend arbitration. If you don't attend, you automatically lose. So that's why they do that, and they do that in a court-like setting. Each side introduces evidence and is heard by an arbiter. Again, it's an inquisitorial mode. It's not strictly speaking a court. There's no powers of contempt. But it's a court-like setting. It's very formal in style and structure. But all of these things are really just designed to reduce cost. It's so much cheaper going and getting mediators and things like that to go through and do that. But a couple of things you guys do need to think about. What are some of the downsides? What do you think some downsides of doing mediation, for example, are? What are some downsides? Yeah. What are some downsides? Good. Yep, it's not binding. What are some other disadvantages through doing mediation? Which one?
Who is in the right will lose something.
Again, you can't determine a right or a wrong in mediation. You're just trying to resolve your dispute without determining a right or wrong. It's all very arm-wavy, airy-fairy in a lot of ways. Some of the other problems is that having mandatory mediations, you have to wait, book a mediator, it can just take extra time. If the parties were never going to resolve it in mediation, it was pointless. There's no point, you're just wasting time. Another problem can be a fishing expedition. What does it mean by that? It means that the sides come together, talk about stuff, and then the other side realizes things they didn't know beforehand, takes that away, withdraws from mediation, uses that. And they can't use that as evidence, but they can use it to adjust their legal strategy or their business strategy as a result. So you have to be careful with mediation, because putting all your cards on the table can put you at a disadvantage because it's not binding. Whereas in court, you want to put your cards on the table where need be, because it's you want to use it and adduce evidence as a result to try and reach a particular result.
If the case is meant to be mediated before
Yes.
going
Yep.
to court,
Yep.
and one one of the parties does not want to mediate.
Yep, happens a lot in
And
family
they
law.
don't
Yep.
cooperate.
Yep. What
Are
happens?
they bound?
Nope.
Or does it go automatically to court?
You get in some. See you, Jackie. You get in some jurisdictions. So in family law, has anyone had to do family law mediation at any stage? Probably not. Good, you've all dodged that bullet. The way it works in family law, if you wish to go and change your consent order or do things through the family court, you must, in child-related matters, you must seek mediation. It is quite common for people to not turn up. What happens is the other side gets a Section 60 capital I certificate that says this party turned up to mediation, this party didn't. You then take that certificate to court and you ask the court to change the thing. You just win, essentially. That's how that works. People don't turn up. You're allowed, it's not that you're allowed to do what you like, but you have, by right, you can apply for court to get things changed. The other side is going to have to come back with some reasons to why they didn't engage with the process as part of that. Mediation with disputes, I think it's a requirement in QCAT. I'm not sure whether or not if you don't turn up to mediation yourself, whether you can carry on. I think it's mandatory. You as the applicant have to. I think if the other side don't turn up, you can then go to QCAT and have the matter heard. That's not obliged for the respondent to turn up. Other disadvantages, it's in a lot of situations, things are a zero-sum game. What do we mean by zero-sum game? Economists in the room. Economists, what's a zero-sum game? There is one winner and there is one loser. There's a finite amount of resources. You're just fighting about who is going to get the biggest chunk of those resources. In theory, mediation is to try and bypass that. And so that, like, you get, say our mum's died and we're fighting over the will and we don't really want to go to court because going to court's expensive. You get mum's paintings, I get mum's porcelain spaniels or whatever. We might find in mediation that those were the things that we truly wanted. Whereas if there's a packet of money and only a packet of money, we're just fighting over how much money we're going to get.
Yeah.
That's a zero-sum game. Winners and losers. It's a finite packet of a fungible thing. There's no other way around it. Possibly one of us wants the other one to apologize for long-lost grievances. That might have something, but at the end of the day, it's just about the money. Okay, guys, so I think I might leave it at that. What I really want you guys to do, though, as part of the this, because there's a few slides, is to just go through, carry on, and answer the rest of those stat interpretation questions. Just have a little think about it, and if you can, bring your things along next week, particularly with an explanation. Why is this company resident or not resident? Why is this person resident or not resident? They are domicile, they aren't permanent place of abode, and so on. That's really what we're after here. You'll have to explain it next week. You'll explain it to us next week. That's really good, guys. Yeah, sure. Question, yes. Sure.
So the bad things about ADR.
Yes.
The third one, I
Yep.
didn't get it.
Time.
Yeah.
Time is one.
The money part.
Zero-sum game. Sometimes it is only about the money.
Simpler terms.
If we're arguing about exactly the same thing, it's only about money. All right? If we're arguing only about who gets money, there's no mechanism for us to have any middle ground. I just want as much money as I can get. You want as much money as you can get. We're just arguing about that. We're not trying to come up with a win-win situation. There's going to be one winner and one loser. Okay, that's one mechanism.
There's no half-half.
Well, again, that might be usually that's the result. If, for example, if we were arguing about our mother's will, probably that's what courts are going to do in those sorts of arguments.
Then why is it a bad part of ADR? Because ADR might say, why go to court and do something?
Oh, it might. They absolutely might. But we're not going to do anything that the court's not going to do otherwise, like that. So that you're good. I mean, that might be it. Maybe that does resolve it. But usually with mediation in particular, we're trying to find creative solutions to stuff. And if it's only about money, there's no creativity. The other one, I guess the other most important one, is when one party, one person in mediation is wrong about the law and the other side knows it, that can be really problematic. That's why you don't, I don't know, buy houses with lawyers or something. I don't know those things.
Who can mimic, who can do ADR? Anyone can do ADR?
Absolutely. Negotiation itself, without any third party, you can just do as part of the process of business. So this is actually, ADR is actually an important component of contemporary business because it's trying to avoid courts altogether. That's really how and where that sits. So that's why it sits. So that's why I would recommend that you guys do just go through, spend a few minutes finishing that. Yeah, of course. I'll do it next week. Yeah, that's fine. We'll run over those things.
Can we get an example of the exams, see them from the past?
Sure. Yeah, I think we can find that. I do have to check that one because I'll have to get permission if they're not released to the library. But I don't think it'll be problematic. I write a different exam every year, so it's probably not problematic. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. The style. Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. The assessment. The first one, the test is coming first. That's the first thing. I said I was going to release it. I'm probably going to release it after next week's material because there's really no point releasing the thing for this week. I haven't finished it either.
The test will be like
Multi-choice. Oh, what are the?
studying, like revomiting.
It's formative. It's completely formative. It's like, which of the following ADR principles rank these and from most formal to least formal, for example, that sort of thing. So which of these are more formal, which of these are less formal, or what's the purpose of equity? There's questions like that. It's a summative test. It's just what knowledge do you have?
How many
From
questions?
20, 1 mark each. It's pretty easy. The final exam is 50. That's at the end of the semester.
Okay, so you still have a 30.
And the 30 is the assessment. Like I said, I'll probably see if I can write it this week and release it next weekend. Cheers.
It's a project.
It'll be an individual task, and it'll be a written one. It's probably this year going to be lots of small questions rather than one big one. I think this is probably a better way of doing it. I'll follow a similar style in terms of these things. And so it'll be really you guys thinking about stuff, critically appraise this, analyze this. More verbs, AQF9 verbs, in other words. Yeah, it should be more thinking than other words. Yeah, right.
I'm not sure about these three things. What is
Okay, negotiation is where you're just talking with the other party. No third parties, just us negotiating. Try to work out a result without going to court. It's just what you do in business all the time.
Yeah, that's fine.
So the difference between that and that, this has a third party act as the go-between, and so they're the ones. Sometimes look.
Like a judge?
No, not the opposite of a judge. Like a nice person, usually, older people or this that usually have training in this process because you find that a lot of mediation situations, people hate each other. They don't want to be in the same room, and so as a result, it's hard to negotiate with people when you. Abhishek wants to punch me in the head because I owe him all his money, and so it's hard to do that. So the mediators often act as the go-between. Sometimes they'll be in different rooms, and the mediator will go between to try and see if they can get a result between themselves or thrash out some ideas. Whereas conciliation is kind of like that, but the conciliator is actively trying to reach a result by the end. They've got a vested interest to try and do that. Maybe they get paid more or what have you. Then when you've got this one here, expert, that is where each side adduces evidence, usually confidentially. They go to a third party, and so that you can essentially build your case.
Similar to judge?
Similar to a judge. Often you can get lay people, or you can have lay people do it, but usually you do get barristers to do it because they are looking at the strength of legal argument as well as factual ones. They look at that and work it out and try and say, look, if this goes to court, in my opinion, you're going to win, you're going to lose. So that's the advantage of that. They're not always right, but particularly if it's strongly one way or the other, when going and giving their explanation back to the two parties, it can strongly sway their opinion either way in terms of doing it, but it's not binding. They don't have to do it. They're just, if you've gone and spent a few $1,000s getting it appraised, and the appraisal says, you're going to win, you're going to lose, as a business decision, it becomes a much poorer decision to carry on going to court as a result. And that can have consequences, business consequences as well. I'm just going to pretend the recording off. All right, guys, thanks for that.